This evening's question is, did Jesus rise from the dead? And for me, this is one of the most important as well as interesting topics for discussion. And let me explain why. Like my opponent, Dan Barker, I too went through a period of intense skepticism and questioning of my faith earlier in life. In fact, it was right around the same time he was going through his about 20 years ago. I was in graduate school at the time. I was specializing in the study of New Testament Greek and planning on going into the ministry. When I finished graduate school, I was encouraged by two churches to apply for their vacant pastor's position, but I declined because I didn't know where I stood with Christianity or the Bible at that moment. But after several years of really wrestling through the issues and looking at the data, I came to a different conclusion than Dan did in his search. I concluded that God exists and that he has actually revealed himself to mankind in Jesus Christ, and that the Christian view provides the most plausible and unified theory of reality. And it was the evidence for Jesus' resurrection that I found very compelling. Now, the reason Jesus' resurrection is so important is because the truth of Christianity hinges on this event. You see, while on earth, Jesus made some really radical claims. Now, when you go around making claims like this, your critics are going to ask you to show some signs, some proof or something. And Jesus' critics were no different. And when they did ask for a miracle or a sign, he said, "I'll give you one sign, my resurrection from the dead." So the bottom line is this: if Jesus did not rise from the dead, then it means he flunked his own test and he's a false prophet whom no rational person should follow. On the other hand, if Jesus did rise from the dead, then it seems to me that he did so in confirmation of his personal and radical claims, and that gives us something that we're all going to have to think about. Well, then the question comes up, well, is there any good historical evidence that Jesus did indeed rise from the dead? I think that there is. You see, in antiquity as today, almost all writings contain traces of bias and propaganda, and some more than others. But nevertheless, with these in mind, professional historians are able to sort through the text and identify kernels of historical truths, or what they refer to as a basic layer of historical truths. Now, for example, both Tacitus and Suetonius mention the Great Fire of Rome. Now, these two of the greatest Roman historians differ significantly on details regarding the event. In fact, they can't even be harmonized. Nevertheless, historians believe that the fire itself occurred. That's that basic layer of historical truth I'm referring to. Oxford University historian A.N. Sherwin-White says that the professional historian can identify this basic layer even in the most deplorable of third-hand sources. Now, when we come to the New Testament, scholars are looking for this basic layer of data. And although they are in much disagreement in the field over what can be known about Jesus apart from faith, there is almost a unanimous agreement regarding certain facts that are well evidenced. Tonight I'm going to focus on a few of these facts that form that basic layer that we're referring to. The facts I'm going to present are from a study that was concluded last year by Professor Gary Habermas, a specialist in the study of Jesus' resurrection. Habermas did a massive study of over 1,400 sources in English, German, and French on where scholars from 1975 to present stand on a number of issues related to Jesus' resurrection. And he found that there are a number of facts that are, number one, they're well evidenced, and number two, they're granted by virtually every single scholar who studies the subject, even the rather skeptical ones. Habermas refers to these as minimal facts. Tonight, I'm going to present some of these facts for you in my case for Jesus' resurrection. The benefit, I believe, of this type of approach to Jesus' resurrection is that it allows us to consider this question and answer it, did Jesus rise from the dead, looking at it like a historian would, rather than considering, is the Bible inerrant or is it inspired? So by doing this, we don't have to consider other issues about Jesus' resurrection, such as what was the nature of his resurrection body, and some of the events described in the Gospels. It's just like arguing for democracy without having to argue for that one must also be a Republican. So what are some of these minimal facts that Habermas discovered? Well, allow me to present 4 this evening. Fact number 1, Jesus' death by crucifixion. That Jesus was executed by crucifixion is reported in all 4 Gospels. However, even a number of non-Christian sources mention the event. Josephus, Tacitus both mention that Pontius Pilate crucified Jesus. And you have Lucian, who in the middle of the 2nd century mentions, and he's a little later than Josephus and Tacitus, he mentions that Jesus was executed by crucifixion. And then even Mara bar Serapion in the latter part of the 2nd century mentions the event. Even the highly critical New Testament scholar of the Jesus Seminar, John Dominic Crossan, writes that he was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be. Fact number 2. Jesus' disciples believed that he had risen from the dead and had appeared to them. At least 9 sources in antiquity attest to the disciples' claims of Jesus' resurrection appearances. You have Paul, you have an early creed, such as one found in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, early sermon summaries, such as those found in Acts, all 4 Gospels, and 2 apostolic fathers who most likely were disciples of the apostles. And those 2 would be Clement of Rome and Polycarp. All of these attest to the disciples claiming that Jesus had risen and had appeared to them. Moreover, a number of sources in antiquity attest to the willingness of these disciples to suffer and even die for their conviction that the risen Jesus had appeared to them. This, of course, doesn't prove that their convictions were true, since we're all too aware that people are willing to kill themselves for their cause. Nevertheless, we wouldn't accuse people like, let's say, Muslim terrorists who blow themselves up in their cause. We wouldn't accuse them of dying for a known lie, because liars make poor martyrs. They died for what they believed to be true, and thus it is with the disciples. They were willing to suffer and even die for their belief that Jesus had risen from the dead. So we can establish that not only did the disciples claim that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them, they really believed it. Paula Fredrickson of Boston University, not a believer, comments, "I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. That's what they say, and then all the historic evidence we have afterwards attests to their conviction that that's what they saw. I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw, but I do know that as an historian, that they must have seen something." Fact number 3. The church persecutor Paul converted to Christianity because he believed that the risen Jesus appeared to him. Paul's change from being one of the church's most aggressive advocates to one of the church's greatest enemies to one of its greatest advocates is granted by virtually all scholars who studied the subject. This fact is testified by Paul himself and confirmed both by Acts as well as an early oral tradition that was circulating in Judea at the time. Thus we have early eyewitness and multiple attestation to this fact. Moreover, his sufferings and martyrdom on behalf of the gospel are reported by several sources in antiquity attesting to the sincerity of his belief to have seen the risen Jesus. Fact number 4. The conversion of the skeptic James, the brother of Jesus, because he too believed that he had witnessed the risen Jesus. Although we don't have the same wealth of historical information on the life of James that we have for Paul, we have enough information to conclude that after the alleged event of Jesus' resurrection, James became a convert to Christianity because he believed that Jesus had risen from the dead and appeared to him. The Gospels report that Jesus' brothers, including James, were unbelievers prior to his death. After that, one of the ancient oral traditions, in fact, the one found in 1 Corinthians 15, mentions an appearance, a post-mortem appearance of Jesus to James. Then James is identified in several sources as a leader of the church in Jerusalem. And then later on we find in 3 sources, one of which is non-Christian from the 1st century, Josephus, that James was martyred for his faith. Gary Habermas shares the results of his recent research regarding the beliefs of Paul and James that the risen Jesus had appeared to them. He says, in particular, the credibility of the Apostle Paul's testimony that he also had an experience that he believed was an appearance of the risen Jesus is recognized by virtually all scholars. Likewise well recognized is that James, the brother of Jesus, was an unbeliever before he thought that he too met the risen Jesus. Seldom are any of these occurrences challenged by respected critical scholars, no matter how skeptical. So now we have to ask ourselves, what would have led Paul and James in their anti-Christian mindset to come to the belief that Jesus had risen and had personally appeared to each of them? I'm going to add a 5th fact, and that's the empty tomb. Now, this isn't part of Habermas's minimal facts. Notwithstanding, it's still well evidenced, and it's granted by around 75% of all scholars today, but it's not granted by nearly all of them, like the other 4 minimal facts. Let me provide you with 3 arguments for the empty tomb. Number 1, the Jerusalem factor. It would have been impossible for Christianity to get off the ground in Jerusalem if the body had still been in the tomb. All the Jewish and Roman authorities would have had to do is publicly display the corpse, and the hoax would have been over. Brings us to our second point, and that is that it's enemy attested. The critics of Jesus, those who wanted him destroyed, the Jewish leadership, the first thing that they were spreading around that we know of from Matthew and as well from Justin and Tertullian afterward is they were going around saying that the disciples stole the body, which seems to be implying that it wasn't there for examination. I mean, why would you say that the tomb was, disciples stole the body if it was there for examination? It seems to me that, again, all you'd do is you'd expose the body and publicly display it, and the scandal is over. And third, if the empty tomb was an invention, it seems that it would have been quite a scandal to list the women as the primary witnesses to it. Because you see, in the first century, the testimony of a woman wasn't highly regarded. Now, there is conflicting testimony of this within the ancient accounts like the Jewish Talmud. Notwithstanding, the majority of critics today say, on whole, the testimony of women wouldn't have gotten much mileage out of the empty tomb. And so if someone were inventing that account, why not just avoid the women issue altogether and allow and make up the men as the witnesses to the empty tomb, like the disciples, Joseph of Arimathea or Nicodemus. Thus, we see that there's good evidence for the empty tomb. William Wand of Oxford University writes, all the strictly historical evidence we have is in favor of the empty tomb, and those scholars who reject it ought to recognize that they do so on some other ground than that of scientific history. In conclusion, I've approached the evidence for Jesus' resurrection using a minimal facts approach. This approach doesn't require the general trustworthiness of the New Testament, much less its being inerrant or inspired by God. Rather, it only considers facts that are, number one, well evidenced, and number two, they are granted by nearly every scholar who studies the subject. I presented 4 facts that meet that criteria, and a 5th fact that is both well evidenced and granted by about 75% of all critics. Now, certainly, Jesus' resurrection explains all these adequately, but we have to ask ourselves, what's the best explanation? Is there another explanation, like a naturalistic explanation, that can account for all 5 of these facts? I think in the end we're going to see that in the absence of any plausible naturalistic theories, Jesus' resurrection is the best explanation for the facts. Am I out of time? Okay. So that's not a signal. So all 5 of the facts I've presented are well evidenced. So since they are, Dan will either have to show that the large majority of scholars today are mistaken in accepting these facts, or he's going to have to present an alternative theory that will account for all 5 of them, and that is at least as plausible to the theory of Jesus' resurrection. Explaining 3 or 4 of these theories won't do, since all 5 of these facts are well evidenced. Until and unless he does this, the resurrection of Jesus stands as the most plausible explanation of the known historical data. Thank you.
Now we hear from Dan Barker.
Since I'm holding this microphone, it's easier to stay seated. I think you understand. Thank you, Mike. And thank you, Atheists of Wisconsin and Student Impact, Aaron and Emily and all you hard workers for putting this event on in my own hometown, close enough to walk to. I used to believe in the resurrection of Jesus. I believed it so strongly that I dedicated my life to it. I traveled as an evangelist. I was a minister in churches. I was a missionary in Mexico. In fact, I even wrote a musical about the resurrection of Jesus Christ in the late 70s, which is still being performed, by the way. And I'm still getting royalties from this, which is kind of fun. I put the money to good use. I believed, like what Paul said, if Christ be not risen, then our faith is in vain. And I dedicated my life 100%. I was a born-again Christian, an evangelical. I had a soul-winning ministry where people would come to pray and give their lives to Jesus and be reborn. All of that. The Bible says, by their fruits you shall know them. And my life manifested all of the fruits of the Spirit. I was sincere. I was not a phony. But then I changed my mind. I can't tell you that whole story tonight. I wrote a book about it, explaining how you can go from a soul winner to an atheist, basically through reading. Part of it was the resurrection of Jesus. Thomas Paine wrote, more than 2 centuries ago, is it more probable that nature should go out of her course or that a man should tell a lie? We have never seen in our time nature go out of her course, but we have good reason to believe that millions of lies have been told in the same time. It is therefore at least millions to one that the reporter of a miracle tells a lie. That's common sense. All of us believe that about other religions. We believe that about Christians. I used to believe that about Muhammad and the angel Gabriel giving him the recitations. As a non-Mormon, I believe that about Joseph Smith. It's easy to dismiss the lies and the fables and the exaggerations of other religions, but when it comes to our own faith, we think they are so precious. David Hume wrote, "No testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle. No testimony, unless that testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish." Carl Sagan liked to say, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." There's no doubt that the claim that a man who was brain dead and heart dead for a number of days or a number of hours, who resuscitated bodily from the grave, there's no doubt that that is an extraordinary claim. That thing doesn't happen all the time. If it did, if people were routinely raising from the graves of Madison, well, then the miracle wouldn't count for much, would it? It has to be a special thing for it to count for a sign of God's power. So, yes, it's an extraordinary claim that a dead man came back to life bodily. But I don't think we even need to look for extraordinary evidence. I think in the case that Mike just gave us tonight, we don't even have close to ordinary evidence. I would think, let's first get the case up to ordinary evidence. Ordinarily, we would seek some kind of corroboration for the story from the contemporaries. Did you know that there is no corroboration for that story anywhere in the first century? Do you know that at least 40 people wrote about the early years of the Roman Empire in great detail, many of them about that area and about other self-proclaimed Christs, but nothing about Jesus? If Jesus really had resurrected from the dead, why are we only hearing it from his followers? Why did he not go to Pilate's front door and knock and say, "Hey, I'm here"? Why didn't he go to Herod's door? Why didn't he go to some historian? Why didn't he do it in the 20th century when we had video cameras? You know, when we could corroborate things a little bit better. Why are we having to rely on second, third, fourth-hand testimony? If it was ordinary testimony, we'd be able to cross-examine our witnesses. In a court of law, we'd be able to put them on the stand and look and find out something about these supposed witnesses. Peter, James, Paul. We can't do that. All of the Gospels were written anonymously. We don't know who wrote any of them. They were writing secondhand. They were writing late. We don't know anything else they wrote to check their veracity or their reliability. All we have are these religious, admittedly propagandistic documents. John even admits it, "I'm writing that you may believe." We can't cross-examine the witnesses. We have no idea of checking what kind of habits they are in about telling the truth or not. Especially given the fact that we know that human nature has this immense propensity to exaggerate, especially on religious grounds. If we had some direct eyewitnesses, that would be ordinary testimony. But you know what? We do not have a single eyewitness testimony of the resurrection itself. Well, actually, we do. The Roman soldiers said that they came and stole the body. But I doubt that you believe that eyewitness testimony. There is no eyewitness testimony. Ordinarily, you would expect to have some eyewitness testimony. The people in the first century, when they heard the stories, when the women came back from the tomb, the disciples said, their stories seem to us like idle tales. They didn't even believe the story. These women that they knew came back and told them, they didn't believe it. If they didn't believe it, why should I? Thomas, when Thomas heard the story, he did not believe it. These were people he knew and trusted, and he did not believe them. If Thomas didn't believe, why should I believe? Let me tell you what happened. Jesus did not bodily rise from the dead. People do not bodily rise from the dead. If they're really dead, they're dead. Well, my mom was resuscitated a couple of times through heart surgery, but she wasn't actually totally dead, you know. I mean, and if Jesus rose from the dead, well, then my mom would count as a resurrection as well. But supposedly Jesus was dead for how many days? Half a day or 2 or 3 days, depending on how you count it up. What happened is this. Jesus may have been publicly executed. That's a point that we can grant. There may have been a self-proclaimed Messiah named Yeshua who was publicly executed. There were others. That's not implausible. That's not extraordinary. It may not have happened, but let's just grant that it did. Then his disciples were upset about this. His disciples, especially Peter. You know who the very first testimony is? If we were having a court of law, who would be the first witness on the stand? When Paul wrote his account in 1 Corinthians 15, the first name he listed was Peter. Well, we know Peter is an admitted liar. The Bible tells it very clearly that Peter, when it counted the most, when he had promised to be loyal to Jesus, Peter lied, basically lied under oath to these officials, saying, no, I never knew Jesus. And he did it 3 times. What kind of credibility can you give to that testimony? A man who lies when it really matters the most, he would be laughed off the stand in a court of law. Jesus died, let's say. The disciples on Black Sabbath were going, what in the world is happening here? They were upset. Then, Peter and others believed that Jesus ascended to heaven spiritually. That Jesus resurrected spiritually, not bodily. They believed that what happened to Jesus was the same thing that Christians believe happens to grandma when she dies, or what's going to happen to you when you die. You're going to die, your body's going to rot in the grave, but hallelujah, your soul's going to ascend into heaven. That's what the early Christians believed, and you can prove it using the New Testament documents. The earliest account we have, can we put up that thing about, that thing you typed in for me? If you can find it. There it is, okay. This is the earliest thing we have written. This was written around the year 55, which is a quarter of a century after the events. Jesus, if he was executed in the late 20s, maybe the year 30. This was the first thing we have written, 25 years later, written to a people in Corinth, which is more than 1,000 miles away. And Paul writes, and he obviously edits this thing. This is like a little hymn or a formula that he's reciting that he said he received from someone. Well, you can't see it. Well, just turn that off. I'll just talk about it. He said, Jesus was buried, he rose, and then he appeared to people. First to Peter, then to James, and then he obviously edits it because he said he appeared to me. So he's monkeying with the text a little bit. That word buried is not a tomb. The word tomb or sepulcher didn't come until Mark, which was around the year 70. Buried, what they did with executed criminals in those days was they just buried them in a common pit. If there's no mention of a tomb, there can hardly be an empty tomb if there's no mention of a tomb in this passage. And then Paul said that he raised. That word raised is not the word resurrected. Resurrected is anistemi or anastasis. He used the word egiro, which means that he raised. It's the word for waking up. All through the New Testament you find that word egiro. When Jesus was asleep in the boat, the disciples went and woke him up. No one thinks he resurrected from the bottom of a boat. He could have used resurrected, but he didn't. He used the spiritual word, egiro. Jesus was buried and then he rose, he ascended. And then the word appeared, ophthi, he appeared to these people. That word is the word used for visionary appearances. That is not a bodily appearance. Remember the story of the Transfiguration? When James and Peter went to see Jesus transfigured, and guess who appeared to them? Moses and Elijah. Remember that story, Christians? Well, that's the same word, ophthi. Moses and Elijah appeared to Peter using that same word. You think Moses and Elijah appeared bodily? Of course not. They were having this spiritual experience. Otherwise, we should look for the empty tomb of Moses, right? And Paul's using these words that were used by the primitive Christians, not for a bodily resurrection, but for a spiritual resurrection, ascension into heaven, where the body just stayed where it was. Now, I have to move on. In the year 70, the first gospel we have written was Mark, and you also notice it's very, very simple. Maybe there's one extraordinary event in that story. There was a man with white robe on. Maybe that was an angel. In the year 80, we get to Matthew and Luke. Then we start seeing more extraordinary events. By the time we get to the year 80, a half century later, we start seeing these rolling stones and earthquakes and angels. And then John was written in after the year 90, 95 or so. Then we start getting these fantastic. And you know what you can see? If you take these appearances, starting with 55 was Paul, 70 was Mark, 80 was Matthew, 85 was Luke, and 90 or 95 was John. If you count up the number of extraordinary events that are in these stories, you'll notice a curve. In the beginning, there's 0. With Paul, there's 0. With Mark, maybe there's 1. With Matthew, we have 2 or 3. And by the time you get to John, by the end of the century, 60 or 70 years later, we start having these extraordinary events. You know what that shows? That shows the pattern of legendary growth. The earliest Christians did not believe what the later Christians believed. The later Christians believed in all these great appearances and touching of Jesus. But the mistake modern Christians are making, the mistake Mike is making, is that he's looking at the primitive Christians through the lens of the later group, which was the second or third generation of believers who were exaggerating, who were making up the story. Yes, they did believe that Jesus ascended. The early Christians believed it was spiritual. The later Christians, who were not part of the primitive church, believed that there was some kind of a bodily resurrection as legends grow, as they grow and as they develop. Therefore, I can probably, for the sake of argument, 1 minute, I can probably grant most of Mike's minimal points, but interpret it as a spiritual resurrection, not as a bodily thing. Just like when my granddad died, my grandma swore that he kept coming back in the room talking to her. And I said, Grandma, well, that's a hallucination or a dream. And she said, no, it's real. I see him. He comes in, he waves at me, he talks to me, he opens drawers. I said, Grandma, it's very real, but it's in your mind. It's happening in your mind. And so when Peter prayed, Jesus, forgive me, he told his friends, Jesus forgave me. And they said, you saw Jesus? Peter saw Jesus. And so you know how the story grows and how it gets going. And then you know how religious fervor gets into people, especially after their Messiah died. With this disconfirmation, they wanted it to come back. They brought it back in the form of a religion called Christianity. Jesus did not bodily rise from the dead, but something did happen to cause some people to believe that he spiritually rose from the dead.
Now we'll have 8-minute rebuttals from each, starting with Mike.
I'll just stay seated this time then. Thank you, Dan, for that opening statement. Dan mentioned a couple of things, and I'm glad to see that he grants at least the crucifixion of Jesus' death by crucifixion. He also seemed to grant my second through fourth facts, that the earliest Christians believed that Jesus rose from the dead and had appeared to them. He does say that it was a spiritual resurrection rather than a bodily one, though. I disagree with that. And let me just start to go through the facts that he provides here and answer them. He says, first of all, that we have second, third, and fourth-hand witnesses. Well, it depends what you want to look at here, but when we're talking about this creed in 1 Corinthians 15, scholars date that very early. In fact, Dan himself puts it within 25 years, because 55 is when Paul probably wrote 1 Corinthians. And let me just give you a little timeline. You got Paul writing that in 1 Corinthians 15. That's in 55. Crucifixion is in 30 probably, okay? Now Paul there, he says, I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. I gave to you what I also received. This is one of the reasons scholars look at this as a creed, because those are two technical terms in the rabbinic language denoting the imparting of oral tradition. So when was he there? Well, most scholars believe that he was there in 51. So this creed, this material that he passed to them, he says, I gave to you in 51. Well, then when did Paul receive this? Well, most critics believe that Paul received this creed within about 5 years of the crucifixion of Jesus. Because most scholars believe Paul was converted between 1 to 3 years after Jesus' crucifixion. So let's say 2. That puts us in the year 32. And Paul says 3 years later, after his conversion, he went up to Jerusalem and met with Peter. And the word in the Greek used there in Galatians 1:18, hysteresai, from which we would get history. And so he was going up to get first-hand testimony, he said, from Peter himself about the life of Christ and what had happened. So he's hearing this right from Peter. And then he says he met James while there. And then he said 14 years later, he goes back up to Jerusalem to meet with them again. And this time he met with Peter, James, and John, the three biggest apostles, and then himself. So you got these four guys here. And he says that he gave him, ran by the gospel that he had been preaching. Of course, the resurrection was the centerpiece of that. And he says they extended the right hand of fellowship, meaning that they accepted his and endorsed his gospel as the same that they were preaching. And in fact, Paul himself in 1 Corinthians 15 says that he was preaching the same thing as the disciples were regarding the resurrection of Jesus. So we do have firsthand testimony from Paul. Paul says that he saw the risen Jesus himself. Plus, if this creed comes from the apostles, as most critics believe, then we've got firsthand testimony there as well. Plus, most critics believe that the sermon summaries, well, I'd say about 70% of critics believe that these early sermon summaries in Acts, like Acts 2, 10, and 13, have apostolic origin to them, because the Greek that is recorded there by Luke is awkward and contains Semitisms. So it would seem that it was translated from another language, and since it's Semitisms, Aramaic, into Greek. And so most critics, again, do believe that that goes back to the apostles themselves. So we do have firsthand testimony. And besides, even if we didn't, we still established through multiple early testimony that this is indeed what the disciples were claiming. So it's irrelevant if they were second, third, or fourth-hand testimony. The majority of critics today say we've got a lot of evidence, and I listed you 9 sources, and at least one, Paul, was an eyewitness for that. And to claim that the disciples were saying that he rose from the dead and appeared to him. Well, then he says, what we have here is propaganda. He says, John said, I'm writing that you may believe. And so therefore we shouldn't believe because we shouldn't trust John because of that? Well, Dan, you've written a book, Losing Faith in Faith. Dan has written a book so that we may not believe. Sounds to me like that's propaganda. Should we throw your book out because of that? I don't think so. I think we consider, and we do like professional historians do, we weed through the material and get to that basic layer of historical truths that the historians look for. And then Dan says, well, if people are dead, they're dead. They're not going to rise. And he quotes Payne, Hume, and Sagan on this. Well, I agree that a person who dies, you've got the second law of thermodynamics here, that their body's going to decay. They're not coming back to life by natural causes. But folks, no one is claiming that Jesus came back to life by natural causes. The claim is that God raised Jesus from the dead. And I don't see any reason why, if God exists, that there'd be any reason to say that this author of life couldn't likewise raise someone from the dead and give that person life if he wanted to. He says, well, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I think we have that. I think we've got extraordinary evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. We've got eyewitnesses. We've got not only to individuals did Jesus appear, but to groups, not only to friends, but to foes. And we've got an empty tomb. So the fact is Jesus was dead and that he was seen by a number of people afterwards. And like I said in my opening statement, in the absence of any plausible naturalistic explanations, I don't see any reason why the conclusion Jesus rose from the dead should be abandoned. He said there's no, it's falsehood, quoting Hume, its falsehood must be more improbable than the event itself if we're going to accept a miracle. Well, I think so, because how are we going to account? Dan himself said that they saw something that they believed was a risen Jesus. Well, what was it? We need to postulate some sort of a naturalistic explanation here. You can't just say, well, I don't believe them. Well, what did they see? We know that they saw something. And if it wasn't a hallucination or a delusion, and we know that Jesus really died, well, what was it that they saw? If there's no plausible naturalistic explanations, then Jesus' resurrection wins the day. Well, he says Peter is a liar. He denied Jesus 3 times. Well, come on. The guy was being threatened with torture and a brutal execution. He knew what crucifixions looked like. He knew what he was going to have to go through if he was tortured and killed. I mean, the guy was under a lot of stress. Now, I'm not condoning what Peter did, but let's face it, Peter repented, and he served Jesus for the next 30-plus years and then died as a martyr for his faith. On the other hand, Dan, you served Jesus for 19 years, and you promised to devote your life to him, and then you didn't. You forsook him. And so if anyone here is the liar who hasn't repented, I'm sorry, I'd have to say I'm going to trust Peter because he was willing to go to his death for it. He said, well,
About 1 minute.
1 minute, okay. Jesus' disciples believed he raised spiritually. Let me deal with this thing about the raised. He says they use the term agero, which means raising or wakening out of sleep rather than raising. Anastasis for resurrection, agero from raising out of a sleep, awakening from sleep. Not at all. If you just go down a few more verses in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 12 through 16, you'll find that Paul uses the terms agero and anastasis interchangeably to mean resurrection. Moreover, in John chapter 2, verses 18 through 22, Jesus says, destroy this temple and in 3 days I'll raise it, agero. And John adds, and he was referring to the resurrection of his body. So if he's referring to sleep, let's go to the creed where he says, and he was raised. Well, if he's talking about a physical sleep, Paul adds the parenthetical statement after saying he appeared to more than 500. He says, most of whom remain until the present, but some have fallen asleep. That's why he's using a gero, because asleep was a euphemism to say a person was dead. Much like today we say the person has passed away. If we're going to take Dan's explanation that they were wakened out of a sleep, Paul's adding this 25 years after they saw it. He said, some have remained into the present, but others have fallen asleep. Gosh, these people must have been awfully tired 25 years later. So this really betrays a lack of understanding, I think, of Greek on your part, Dan, and I think that this was evident. I guess I'm out of time, so I'll stop.
You ask, you were going to say something? No. Okay. You ask, so what did they see? Well, what did my grandma see? Would it have helped if I had gone to dig up my grandfather's grave to show her, Grandma, you're hallucinating? Would that have made any difference? I doubt it. She saw what she saw. People do hallucinate. People do imagine. We know that that happens. We don't know that dead people rise from the dead. Now, let's talk about Paul, because this is where the whole story shoots itself in the foot. Mike says that Jesus appeared to Paul. Now, you saw in 1 Corinthians 15 that Paul lists these appearances and then he tacks himself on the end. He's obviously editing it because he couldn't have been reciting something about himself until after himself. And he put it in the first person. How exactly did Jesus appear to Paul? You admit it's at least 2 years later, some years later, right? The body of Jesus supposedly rose from the dead and then physically ascended up into the real clouds. Physical body of Jesus, right? Up there, hanging up there somewhere physically, defying gravity for all this time. Paul is on the road to Damascus, and suddenly he hears a loud noise. He's knocked off his horse. He's knocked blind, and you wonder, how can a blind man see anything? Are you telling me that the physical body of Jesus was floating up in a real cloud above the road to Damascus? The actual physical body? I mean, did he need a haircut? Did he need to shave? I mean, how did he relieve himself? I mean, think about what you're saying. Paul said that Jesus appeared to him, and you use that example to show that what this word appearances mean. I don't think anyone believes that Jesus appeared bodily, physically to Paul at that point. He had what some people would call a spiritual, maybe epileptic experience. I mean, it sort of looks like epilepsy. A person who falls off his horse and hears voices. Paul never claimed to have met Jesus before that. He wouldn't have recognized him. How would he have known who it was? In fact, there's 3 different accounts of that conversion experience, and they disagree with each other, because in one account, the disciples said they heard the voice, and in another account, they said they did not hear the voice. The accounts of the resurrection are hopelessly contradictory, by the way, and if you would like a list of 17 clear contradictions in the resurrection story, there will be some in the back table on the way out, and I don't have time to go through all of them. But clearly, and then when Paul's later explaining to Galatians about his experience, he said, when it pleased God to reveal his Son in me. He described that experience later to the church at Galatia by saying, God revealed his Son in me. He didn't say Jesus came up and shook hands with me. He didn't say, he said, peekaboo, who is this? He didn't say he met a body. For Paul, Jesus was an ascended spiritual Christ, not a real flesh and blood person. Paul never met Jesus. And yet in that same passage that we looked at, we see Paul's non-physical encounter with Jesus put right up next to Peter and James and these others. Obviously, you can't have it both ways. That word ophthi is a visionary or a spiritual experience. He did not bodily meet. If you think he did, then explain to me how the physical body was hanging up there. And where is it now? Does he need to wash his clothes once in a while? I mean, is he physical or not? We don't know how the disciples died. We don't know about how any of them died. It's second-century sources, except for Judas, for which there are 2 contradictory accounts of his death, and Stephen. We don't really know how any of them died. The life expectancy in the first century Rome was 45 years old for surviving children. So anybody who was about Jesus' age around the year 30 would have been dead by the year 55. By life expectancy. Certainly by the year 70, this would have been ancient. These would have been ancient people. And certainly by the 80s and 90s, if these men died horrible deaths of martyrdom and persecution, how did they live long enough to write those Gospels? Being martyred is not a good way to double your life expectancy. Obviously, these books were written by later generations. Burton Mack, a biblical scholar, says that he's convinced that the book of Mark was written by a second-generation fringe person who never knew any of the original followers. This is not first-hand testimony. This shows all the earmarks, and you didn't even address my evidence of legendary growth across history, starting from simplicity, where we have no bodily ascension and no angels and no women at the tomb and no rolling stone and no earthquakes and eclipses and that, until we get to the end, the mistake that Christians make of trying to view the entire Testament as if it were flat, when actually it grew over time. And you take Luke and John and you superimpose it back on the writings of Paul, thinking that you understand what happened to the earliest Christians. That is not what happened. This so-called Jerusalem factor is a phony argument. Who would have been interested to go dig up the grave of another supposed Messiah? Do you know how long it was before they started preaching the resurrection? It was the day of Pentecost, right? You know how many days that was? 49 days, 7 weeks. By the time they started preaching, it was probably a couple of months. By the time anybody might have cared to break the law, because it was a crime to dig up a grave in those days. By the time anyone might have taken this sect seriously enough to care to break the law, and if they had known where the grave was, what happens to a body in that climate, in that part of the world, after 2 months? What happened to Lazarus? After 3 days, he was stinking, right? Suppose they had found the body and found this decomposed skeleton and paraded it through the streets of Jerusalem. Would any of the disciples have believed that that was the body of Jesus? Nobody in their right mind, no critic in their right mind would think they could pull off something like that. Would you have believed it if somebody paraded a skeleton down the streets? No one seemed to know where he was buried. His tomb was never venerated, although the tombs of other supposed resurrected saviors, like Dionysus and others, were venerated, even though the tombs were supposedly empty. This was the tomb was never even as a shrine. In fact, the young man told the women, "Come and see the place where the body lay." So you know Christians would have been going there, right? They do today where they think the shrine is, but they didn't back then. They must not have even known where it was. There must not have even been a tomb. This whole idea of an empty tomb is just this idea to give some credence to the resurrection of the body. The body of Jesus, if he lived and if he was publicly executed, probably rotted in a common grave where it might have been eaten by dogs. That's what happened with most of those executed criminals. There was no sepulcher, there was no tomb, and according to your very own evidence, Paul's testimony of supposedly seeing this ascended Jesus, resurrected Jesus, there were no bodily appearances. The 500 is a conveniently round number. Who in Corinth, a quarter of a century later, would have got that document and said, "Oh, he was seen of 500. Well, what are their names? What are their addresses? Who were they? Why did no other historians of the time notice anything? Why were there no rumors reported during the first century? Why is there a complete silence in history about any of these supposed events?" It looks to me like Paul, Mark, Luke, John, through their religious fervor, through their desire to keep their faith alive, tampered a little bit with the facts. They exaggerated, and why not? They were human beings. Human beings do that all the time. We all do that all the time, don't we? We know of stories all the time of religions coming and growing and people exaggerating and embellishing. So what made those first century human beings exempt? Were they some kind of supernatural cartoon characters who were never tempted to sort of exaggerate the truth a little bit? Or were they more like people that we know human beings really are? It is very respectful to their humanity to assume that they were just people. They maybe got a few things right, but they got a lot of it wrong. And certainly the evidence that Mike has presented and the evidence that we have through these friends and followers of Jesus doesn't even come close to ordinary testimony. I don't believe it. I'm convinced Jesus did not and could not have risen from the grave.
Okay, we'll move to what we've pretty much moved to in these comments, a time when our two debaters can talk to each other and respond to each other. We'll give Mike the first 11 minutes, and then we'll let Dan take 11-minute time of bringing questions and focusing an actual dialogue.
Dan, you'd mentioned how I think the first thing you saw was, well, James, they saw something, but what was it they saw? What did your grandma see? and you said, you mentioned a grief hallucination. And I would agree with that. If she really believed she saw your grandfather, that a grief hallucination sounds like a good explanation for that rather than a resurrection. I don't think that this fits in, and I don't think that this can explain the experiences to the disciples, and I'd like to see how you respond. First of all, in the creed itself, and you'd mentioned a couple times about the evolution in the Gospels. I'm not going to deal with that. I don't think I need to, because the evidence I presented was from very early material, such as the creed, the eyewitness testimony of Paul, and the sermon summaries, which are things which are traced back to the apostles. So just going with that, we've got the fact that Paul said he saw the risen Jesus. And certainly he wasn't in a state of mind where he'd be grieving the death of Jesus. He was glad. He was trying to finish the job and get rid of the Christians. So I don't think grief hallucinations would explain the appearance to Paul. Neither would it explain the appearance to the skeptic James. That James was a pious Jew is implied in Josephus, Book 20, Antiquities of the Jews, Book 20, Section 200, and it's also mentioned by Hegesippus and Clement of Alexandria. And James, being a pious Jew, would have had the rabbinic interpretation of Deuteronomy 21:23, "Cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree." And so he would have seen his brother as cursed by God, and therefore he wouldn't want to follow a false Messiah, so he wouldn't be expecting him to come back. And then grief hallucinations don't explain the empty tomb. If the tomb was empty, well, the body would have still been in there, even if they'd experienced hallucinations. And then finally, we know that hallucinations aren't collective. They're not seen by groups of people as a single hallucination. Like, for example, if we held everybody in here for 5 days and didn't let them go to sleep, then they would start to experience sleep deprivation and would hallucinate. But they wouldn't hallucinate the same thing. I mean, they might hallucinate you flying or me doing something else, but they wouldn't all experience the same hallucination, and yet we have at least three group appearances in the creed itself, which is very early, that talk about Jesus appearing to groups. So how would you respond to those?
Well, I don't think what happened was necessarily grief hallucination. I use my grandmother as an example of what the human mind can do. The human mind is very creative in all sorts of ways. If I'm sleep deprived, I will have some slight things happen in my brain that aren't normal. I mean, we've all gone through that, right? But think of this. Peter supposedly loved Jesus. He promised to be a follower of Jesus. He spent all these years with him, supposedly seeing the miracles, supposedly seeing firsthand all this power and feeling the Spirit of God. He supposedly knew all of this stuff. And when it really mattered, he denied Jesus for whatever reason. Maybe I don't blame him. I'd probably do the same thing. But he did. He did lie, and you admit that he lied when it really could have mattered to him. Because he could have told the truth and expected a miracle to save him, like Jesus could have done. But no, he apparently wasn't trustful enough of the miracles of Jesus to have trusted him to go ahead and tell the truth. Well, Jesus died. They were expecting this kingdom to go on, and then he's crucified. He's executed, publicly executed. It wasn't on a T-shaped cross, but it was on some kind of a stake. And then here's the disciples. They're all upset. And imagine how Peter felt.
If you don't want me to interrupt, just say it, and you can set the tone that way. I'm just hoping that we can have a dialogue, and I know I talked for a little bit, so if you want to finish out, feel free to say that. But as far as the stake and stuff, I mean, I wouldn't mind addressing that.
It's not relevant. It doesn't matter to me. If he died, he was through a public execution of some sort, either on a stake or a T-shaped cross, probably on a stake. The T came from Tammuz later. But imagine how Peter must have been feeling, right? His close friend, he's devoted his life to this guy, these years to this guy, and now he's dead, right? On Black Sabbath, on Saturday, even according to you, there was no resurrection. They were confused, right? Even they've heard him talk. They've heard that verse that you quoted, that I'll raise this temple in 3 days. And they still didn't have any hope. They were confused. Imagine that you had a real nasty fight with your wife or loved one, and you said some things that you really regretted. And then you're thinking, oh gosh, I should apologize for that. I shouldn't have said that. That was horrible. But before you get a chance to apologize, she dies. Well, not only are you dealing with the tragedy of her death, you're also feeling kind of, ooh, I wish the last thing I said to her hadn't been that. Oh, you'd be feeling really horrible. You'd want to be forgiven. You'd want to make it right in some way. You'd wish, you might even say, oh, honey, I'm sorry. You might talk to her, oh, you're dead, but I'm so sorry what I said. I didn't mean it. That's human nature to do that, right? People talk to dead ones, loved ones all the time. So Peter, realizing that he had betrayed his Lord, that he had lied, that he had made a fool of himself, and then he dies before he has a chance to make it right, obviously he's going to be in some mental anguish, maybe not a grief hallucination, but some kind of mental state. Oh, Jesus, I'm sorry. And he believed in the afterlife. He believed in spirits. He believed that Jesus would be alive somewhere. So he would talk, Jesus, please, I'm sorry. Please forgive me for what happened. I'm sorry. And then he hears the voice of Jesus. Jesus says, Peter, I forgive you. All is okay. I know. And now, you know what? Something like that could have happened. It happens all the time with Christians today, right? So Peter says, oh, great, everything is made right. And he goes and he tells his buddies, I talked with Jesus, and everything's okay. And his buddies, Peter saw Jesus? Peter saw Jesus. Jesus appeared to Peter. And then others, well, I'm going to pray too. Oh, yes, Jesus, yes. And Jesus appeared to me. That word appeared, ophthi, you agree, is used all the time for a spiritual, inner psychological appearance. Otherwise, we're looking for is there an empty grave of Moses? Moses ophthi to Peter. Moses and Elijah
appeared. The term
appeared.
is used of seeing the sun. And in Greek, ophthe, in the aorist tense, of course, means that you saw something. It's a sight. So it could mean, hey, this is a sight right here. Now, it can be used in a sense of a vision, like it's used by Paul when he talks about when he was caught up into heaven. But he said, I don't know if it was in the body or not. So for Paul, it was so real, he didn't know if this was something that he would still say it had extramental qualities to it. So no, I disagree that we're talking about a hallucination or some kind of vision.
You do agree with me that ophthi is not necessarily a bodily physical appearance, right?
Absolutely.
Not necessarily.
Right.
And since it's used in the exact same construction in other parts of the Bible, Moses ophthi to Peter, right? Which no one took as a bodily appearance.
I don't know about that. I mean, you're talking about the transfiguration there. Why did Peter say, if it was that type, why did Peter say, let's build shelters for these guys? You don't do that for visions in heaven.
You mean, so Moses died thousands of years earlier and his physical body came back down on that mountain? You're talking about an actual physical body you could reach out and touch?
Yeah.
You think that happened?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Well, when
and the language doesn't say wouldn't prevent that at all.
Well, when Paul got this vision to go to Macedonia, remember that?
Yeah.
The Macedonian appeared to him in a vision. That word was ophthi.
Yeah.
He appeared to him. Was the actual Macedonian standing in the room as a physical man?
I would say not.
No. So you agree that that's an ambiguous word that doesn't necessarily mean a bodily physical appearance.
And exactly why it doesn't. It can mean physical. It may mean non-physical, but that's precisely why you can't use that to say it meant a vision, because now you're saying it's requiring vision, and it doesn't follow.
Okay, you tell me what's more likely. Did my grandfather physically, bodily appear to my grandmother, or was that a mental thing that happened?
I think it was a grief hallucination on your grandmom's part, but that can't account for the appearances to the disciples. It may for Peter. Maybe you could say Peter was in a frame of mind.
Well, Peter was the first one.
Yeah, but it doesn't account for Paul. He wasn't grieving. James wasn't grieving. It wouldn't account for the empty tomb. And hallucinations aren't group appearances. And that's why, Dan, almost all scholars today reject the hallucination hypothesis.
You said 75%, right, of scholars.
The empty tomb.
The empty tomb.
Yeah, the empty
How did
tomb.
you get that number?
That came from Habermas's. And he consulted over 1,400 references by scholars written in English, German, and French since 1975 through the present.
You know about the Westar Institute.
Sure.
Well, you know, there's 75 plus qualified scholars with PhDs or equivalent in the biblical languages, in the studies, who agree that Jesus did not. They're believing Christians, and they believe in God, and they believe in the Spirit, and they believe in miracles. Most of them do. And yet they, on scholarly grounds, reject the bodily resurrection. So
sure they do, but by and far, most scholars today believe that the disciples held to a bodily resurrection. Gert Ludemann, have you heard of him?
I know Gert Ludemann.
Okay, he's an atheist New Testament critic. And let me read you something that Ludemann wrote. And this is on 1 Corinthians 15. Again, Ludemann is an atheist New Testament critic, and he says this: "Let me hasten to add that I do not question the physical nature of Jesus' appearance from heaven, Then he went on to explain why Paul is, in 1 Corinthians 15, referring to a physical body, then adds, all of this derives from Paul's inability to think of the existence of a person after death in a non-bodily form. So you have even critics saying, all right, they don't believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus, but they'll at least say that the disciples held that. The disciples held to a bodily appearance of Jesus. And that's why, the creed, you've got, Paul says that that Christ died for our sins, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day. It's like what goes down in burial comes up in resurrection. And then 4 other times throughout 1 Corinthians 15, he says, it is sown and is raised, it is sown and is raised. What goes down comes up. And then elsewhere in Paul's writings, like Romans 8:11 and Philippians 3:21, he strongly implies bodily resurrection.
Okay, then explain why in that same chapter, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul uses egiro for that formula, but later when he's talking, he mixes egiro and anastasis.
Yep, those terms are used interchangeably.
They're not used interchangeably.
I think if you look at the text, you'll find it.
I've looked at the text. They are used in a comparative way, not an interchangeable way. For example, Paul tells Christians, awake thou that sleepest and rise from the dead. He uses that phrase in the Bible. Awake thou that sleepest and rise from the dead. He's talking to living, breathing Christians, right? Not dead people.
Right.
He's telling them, awake thou that sleepest and arise. And so in other words, he's saying that even anastasis, even that word isn't necessarily a physical thing. He's telling...
Exactly right.
Yeah, exactly. So it doesn't have to be taken. And in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul goes on to say very clearly, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. He's very clear about that. In the same context.
Because this is my 11 minutes.
Actually, let's make that your first question of your 11 minutes.
The flesh and blood, so your first question here, the flesh and blood was a figure of speech. It's like today we say, and New Testament critics agree on this, today we talk about red-blooded males. Well, we're not referring to them as being contrasted with a green-blooded male. And same thing back there when they were saying flesh and blood. If you look in the writings in antiquity, the Jewish writings, you'll find that it's referring just simply to a mortal person. So it wouldn't be a contradiction between Paul saying flesh and blood cannot, and it's saying mortal beings can't enter the kingdom of God. And that fits in perfectly with his use of the terms spiritual. It is sown mortal, it is raised spiritual, meaning a holy body with its spiritual appetites juxtaposed to the natural fleshly body with its sinful appetites.
So how long does that take after a person dies? After their body dies? How long did it take for Jesus' body to change from a physical... Is he still up there in a physical body right now?
I think he is.
A physical body?
Yeah,
and there's blood pumping through his veins and he has to get a haircut?
No, I wouldn't say there's blood pumping through his veins, but we're not saying that. It's a physical body.
Well, you just said it was. Is there a physical body
Yeah,
of
but
Jesus in
then
heaven now?
you're mistaken. You're saying just because it's a physical body that we have all the bodily functions. I mean, you talk about him relieving himself, shaving and everything. Why do we have to assume that that's the case just because it's physical? It's an immortal body. Paul says it is sown mortal. It's sown natural. And he uses the term psychikos for that, which later on, or earlier in chapter 2 of 1 Corinthians, verses 14 and 15, he uses the same terms, psychikos and pneumatikos, to contrast the saved man with the lost man.
So you agree that the body of Jesus that's in heaven right now is different from the body that he had when he was alive on earth?
Yes.
So some change happened somewhere. So where is the body that he had on earth? Where are those molecules?
Okay. I would say that those were regenerated, just like Paul says in Philippians 3, chapter 21, when he says, Jesus, when he returns, will transform our lowly bodies into conformity with his glorious body. And in Romans 8:11, he says that the Spirit of God will, gosh, I forgot. But it's Romans 8:11. Let me look there real quick. But he basically says he will raise our mortal bodies just as he raised Jesus' mortal body. So the thing is, our resurrection hasn't happened. And Christians who die right now, their bodies are still, they've decayed, they're in the grave. We go to be in heaven, just like, say, Moses and Elijah did. But we're not in our resurrection bodies, let's say. It will be, and according to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, at the second coming, then our bodies, our physical bodies, will be transformed into become the final heavenly body that we'll have. So the point is there, this is the theology, and this isn't something I can give evidence for. This would be like what Augustine or Aquinas called a truth of faith. But this isn't what our topic is. Our topic this evening is not the nature of Jesus' resurrection body. It's, did Jesus rise from the dead? So even though I believe in a bodily resurrection, that the Bible teaches that, nevertheless, even if he rose spiritually, he still rose. Spiritual resurrection is resurrection. And that's the topic for tonight's debate. Did Jesus rise from the dead?
Well, of course, the spiritual resurrection cannot be shown to be a historical event. Otherwise, you know, everybody with dead relatives would say that they had a resurrection in their family.
Why? No, I wouldn't say that's a resurrection. Why would
So
you?
when Paul saw Jesus on the road to Damascus, I mean, you agree that he was knocked blind, right?
Yeah.
And a blind man saw Jesus.
Well, I would say that they all saw the bright light. It doesn't say that Paul was blinded on the spot. It said that after the sight went away, then he didn't see anything. He was blind, but it doesn't say he was blind immediately.
So a physical body had this bright light that blinded people. So at that point in time, when this physical body of Jesus was somehow levitating up in the real clouds, above the real ground, in real space-time, was that the first real body that he had, or was that this changed body that he had?
Okay.
Which body was that, after 2 or 3 years?
I would say the changed body. But let me ask you this: are you granting me Acts? Because if you're granting me Acts, then we can really settle this thing with bodily resurrection very easily about Paul.
Well, in Acts we find contradictory accounts of the
Not at all. I don't find that
Yes,
at
we
all.
do. We find that in one case, in Acts 9:7, the men that were with him heard a voice. But later in Acts 22:9, the men that were with Paul heard not the voice. It's a direct contradiction in the Bible.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is a direct. I completely agree.
Let me ask you this: if you've said this a couple of times, I'm just curious. Have you ever taken a course in Greek?
Yes, I have. I've translated much of the New Testament from the Greek language.
How many courses, college courses, have you taken in Greek?
2 years of college Greek.
2 years of college Greek. Okay,
Of
so that
Koine
gets you,
Greek.
That gets you through of Koine Greek, of course. Okay, that gets you through beginners and intermediate Greek. Maybe a course of exegesis. I can appreciate that. Okay, and I've had 5 years of Greek, and I've studied Greek now for 20 years. And you know, I can say these things you're saying, Dan. They just don't add up with the Greek.
Well, then explain it.
Okay,
Tell us
first of
why.
all, in Acts chapter 9, verse 7, where it says they heard the voice. And in Acts 22:9, when it says they didn't hear it, the Greek word for hear is akouo. And it can mean both hear and to understand. So, you know, I think the translators have it correctly. And the majority, if you look at almost any translation of the New Testament, it will say in one, they heard the voice, but they didn't understand what it was saying.
And what was the word in Acts 22:9?
Acts 22:9? Okay.
It's akuo. It's the same word.
Exactly right.
In Acts 9:7, akuontes, it was the participle. They heard the voice. But in Acts 22:9, ikusan. They did not hear the same
They didn't
verb.
understand. It could mean they didn't understand the voice.
Well, then in both cases, it could be understand. It's a contradiction either way you go.
Not at all. Because, see, for first century people reading Greek, that's not going to be a problem at all. Let's suppose the electricity went out in here right now, and no one could see us, you know, except maybe some people here. And then and the sound system was out, but we just kept talking. We kept going. And the next day, someone who was at the back, they're talking about this debate, and they said, yeah, the lights went out, and yep, they kept talking. I heard them talk. But then later on, they say, man, I couldn't hear a word they said. Well, I think we could understand. There's no contradiction there. They understand what we're saying. Yet the word here was used on both occasions. So I don't see anything contradiction here. And even Daniel Wallace, who's a prominent Greek grammarian, and in his book Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics, he talks about this very passage and says, given the field of use of akouo and phone, and the fact that in chapter 9 it's akouo plus the genitive, and in chapter 22 it's akouo plus the accusative.
It's the dative.
It's accusative. He said, well, we can look. You said 22:9?
Well, it doesn't matter. They're two different cases. I agree with that.
No,
But
I've got it right
also-
here. It's the accusative. It's phoneme, tain phoneme. So given that, he says, given the fact that it's taken on a different ending there, he says that certainly harmonizes.
No, that's totally wrong. I've
All right,
studied
now,
this.
so you're saying you with 2 years Greek experience,
Yes.
you're
I'm-
right, and Daniel Wallace, who's a very prominent and respected Greek grammarian, is wrong.
He's wrong, and I can show you exactly why he's wrong. All through the New Testament,
Mm-hmm.
there's a loose interchange of case flexibility. I will show you other cases where those exact words are used to signify opposite words, but where the case changes, it would produce a different contradiction. The case flexibility there does not change the meaning of the word, in spite of what some of these people show. In fact, I wrote a good article on that. Did Paul's men hear a voice? Going into
I
great
read
detail.
it, and I found it problematic for the reasons I've explained.
Well, then look up those verses that I explained, and look at the fact that those cases differ. And what's,
of course
what's
they
the
differ,
problem?
and that's precisely why Wallace says that there's no problem here
But
with
they
the
differ.
harmonization.
They differ in places where Matthew tells a story where they heard the voice of the king, and then Luke tells the same story. They heard the voice of the king. The same story, the same king, and yet different cases. Are you telling me that there's different meanings in both retelling of the same story? Of course not. They were flexible enough to change those cases from the accusative to the dative, and then to the genitive case, without any change in meaning. So that's a bad argument. The contradiction stands. And why not? Why shouldn't there be contradictions in the writings of fallible human beings? Are you defending a complete infallibility of these documents? I don't think
We're
you
not
would
here
go
to
that far.
debate the inerrancy of scriptures. We are here to debate the resurrection of Jesus.
Okay, one more question then.
Yeah.
Will you answer my question, or should I?
Well, what's your question?
You are aware of the fact that women were allowed to count as witnesses. They were allowed to give testimony in a court of law in the first century. They didn't have as high a status as men because the Bible is a patriarchal, sexist book, and the God of the Bible is a patriarchal, sexist male, and so was Jesus. But they were allowed to give testimony, and it is not surprising. It was the custom of the day for dead people to be tended by the women. The women were given that job, and whenever there was in fact, they would sometimes go into mourning for 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 days. So it's not surprising that there would be women there. In fact, it would be surprising if there weren't. And the testimony of women was often regarded in high esteem. Even Jesus said that a woman, even the New Testament says that a woman can sue her husband for divorce, and you can't do that unless your testimony is worth something. So it seems like parroting the testimony of these supposedly women whose tales seemed as idle tales is trying to give more credibility to the story. It doesn't seem very surprising at all to me, and I wonder why you would think that was important.
Well, I'd say, first of all, that insofar as you hold that view that you've stated there, you disagree with the overwhelming majority of scholars.
Well, then I do.
Okay, and that's fine. I'm not saying it because the majority of scholars hold it, that it's therefore true. But in my minimal facts that I presented tonight, and the empty tomb wasn't one of those minimal facts, but I did say about 75% of all critics grant it. It is well evidenced. And the majority of critics, in fact, the main reason that they like the empty tomb is this testimony of women issue. There's an article written by a very highly critical female scholar. I believe she's from Princeton, Osiek. Anyway, she said that the testimony of women, yes, they could do so, but mainly in the first century, their testimony only was good in regards to women's matters, not when it came to things involving males. And so I think the verse that you brought up in Luke is pretty telling of itself, because you're right. When Luke reports that when the women came and told the men about the empty tomb, that they'd seen Jesus, they thought that they were telling silly tales. So even the Christian scriptures there seem to testify to the fact that men just didn't even regard the testimony of women as very valuable at all. So in addition to those 3 arguments that I gave, I like the verse that you gave as well, and I think we could add that to the list, about the testimony of women and how it showed in the first century they weren't highly regarded. So the whole point is this: if the testimony of women was at best questionable, if you're inventing the empty tomb account, why on earth would you place as your primary witnesses people whose testimony isn't going to get you much mileage when you could have used the males?
Well, then let me ask you this. In the earliest document, we're out of time?
We're going to need to move to Mike.
Okay.
A second round of Mike asking questions, and then you can...
Oh, okay, I get it. All right.
All right, let's see, in your rebuttal you mentioned about how did Jesus appear to Paul. We talked about that. By the way, I would also say that a major reason why the appearance to Paul is different than it was to the disciples in the Gospels is because it is a post-ascension appearance. That could account for a lot. So I don't see any contradiction because of that problem right there. You mentioned how in Galatians he said God revealed his Son in me. Well, I looked up a couple scholarly commentaries about that a while back, and it seems like a lot of commentators believe, in fact the majority of commentators believe, that when Paul says, when God was pleased to reveal his Son in me, he's not referring to his conversion experience. He's referring to those 3 years after his conversion experience in Arabia, before he went back up to Jerusalem to meet with Peter. So without that, I don't think you've got much there, again, in terms of Paul having an hallucination. How would you explain Paul's experience? What happened there? You said an epileptic experience. Is that what you believe?
It's
he had
possible.
epilepsy?
What happened to him is consistent with an epileptic seizure. Seeing a bright light, getting blinded, falling off your horse, having to, recover from. That's consistent. We can't know. We can't go back and medically examine these people. We can't go back and psychoanalyze these people. But what we can do is we can show how experiences like the birth of Christianity are even happening today. Myths and legends, stories and belief systems are happening all the time by fallible human beings. We all know it's happening. We see it in other religions. And we can see that psychological happenings or griefs or traumas or some kind of disconfirmation. Robert Price writes about this. You notice that a lot of religions, take the Millerites and the Seventh-day Adventists, or take the Jehovah's Witnesses, take a group that had predicted the end of the world, right? It was going to happen. Just like the early Christians. Jesus is going to bring a kingdom on earth, right? It's going to happen. He's going to be our new king. He's going to be our savior. Well, with the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Millerites, their prophecies failed, right? They failed miserably. And they changed it from 1914. Charles Russell changed it, and then Rutherford said, oops, it wasn't 1914, it's 1925. And then, oops, it didn't happen then. So what? Did the Jehovah's Witness religion just disappear? It got stronger. After the disconfirmation of their expectations, the religion got stronger, right? And Robert Price points out in his book, Beyond Belief, I think that's the title of his book, that maybe a radical disconfirmation of your expectations is exactly what a fledgling religion needs to get off the ground. These original followers of this self-proclaimed Messiah named Yeshua maybe really believed that he was going to bring a new kingdom on earth. He was publicly executed. He was gone, and they felt horrible about it. What do? They go back, they regroup, they think it through, and they come up with some way to keep the religion going and to save face. That happens. You admit that happens. Mm-hmm. It happens today. It happened in the 1800s. It happens with other religions. So what made those people exempt? Were they special? Were they somehow more human than you and I? Were they somehow immune from this kind of exaggerations and all that? That is a plausible naturalistic explanation, which you were asking for. You were asking for.
I don't know that that's plausible in order to account for what happened here. I mean, certainly, yeah, the Jehovah's Witnesses kept going and everything. However, I mean, these guys weren't under necessarily threats of death. That would be one difference there. They weren't having all these enemies, people who were fighting against them saying, oh, I saw Jesus too. I mean, we're talking about here, we can establish that Jesus' disciples really believe that they saw him risen from the dead. We know it wasn't a hallucination, so you're saying here that they were doing it in order to save face or
something like that.
To avoid eating crow. Well, I can understand that kind of. I mean, we've all probably lied at some point in our lives in order to avoid eating crow. But here's the disciples, in that day, the Romans, when they got you, I mean, I just completed a study on crucifixion, and it was a horrible, horrible process. If you want to read up on it, there's several good books out there. One in particular I'd recommend is written by New Testament critic Martin Hengel called Crucifixion. Just an excellent resource on the subject. And so you see these things happening and what the Romans did to their victims in the whipping, the scourging, the crucifixion, the humiliation that took place. Now, these disciples, they didn't want to eat crow, okay? So they made up this lie, and then one by one, they saw as they were being, captured and persecuted, and then they ended up, many of them, we at least know several of them, suffered martyrdom for their faith, and at least they were all willing to do that.
How do you know that? How do you know they suffered martyrdom?
Well, first of all, you've got Clement of Rome, who writes around the year 95, and he talks about the martyrdom of Paul and Peter. A little bit later, you've got Polycarp, who mentions the martyrdom of Paul and some of the other disciples, and the fact that they were all willing to suffer. So the thing is, that's a couple of them right there. Josephus reports the martyrdom of James. So
60, 70 years later, right?
Well, Josephus writes that in 95 probably, but James is probably martyred in 62, and it's certainly within Josephus' lifetime because he's born around 37, so he would have been 20-some, maybe 25 years old at the time. Right at the time when he had become a Jewish priest, and his dad was a very popular priest in Jerusalem, so that places Josephus in the geographic location in which this stuff would have happened. He's aware of the high priest and everything. He would have probably been there. He may have even been an eyewitness to it. We don't know that, but he's certainly in a position to have known about this. So we do know that these guys were willing to suffer and die for their beliefs, that Jesus had risen and appeared to them. And we've got Paul, same thing with him. We've got James, same thing with him. We've got to be able to account for their experiences. So when it comes to the sufferings of the disciples, yeah, maybe they, as a lot of us would lie to avoid eating crow. But I think that for the most part, people would rather eat crow than be eaten by lions. And so I think that as one by one, they saw like Peter get thrown in jail, James stoned, and some of the others, Stephen stoned. I think what would happen is they would reassess their situation. Hey, did we really see him? Did we really see it? You know, when you were looking 20 years ago, you know, you're thinking about the rest of your life and you start to really assess, is my faith true? Well, and I can appreciate that. I went through that too. So the thing is, when your friends are getting hauled off to prison and you're seeing them brutally treated and then some executed, now you're really thinking even more seriously and you're trying to make a quick decision.
I don't think so. I don't think that's how human nature is. Otherwise, those pilots of the planes that flew into the World Trade Center would have veered at the last second.
Why is that?
They believed strongly that they were going to go to their Islamic heaven. They were completely convinced that Muhammad had a miracle, that the recitations came through the angel Gabriel to Muhammad, and they were absolutely convinced to the point of giving their lives for that belief, right?
So the disciples were that convinced that Jesus had appeared to them.
But do you believe that the angel Gabriel gave recitations to Muhammad? You don't, do you?
No, but that's different.
Does their martyrdom convince you that Islam is true?
It's different because the Muslims, just like Christians who would die for their faith today, believe based on the testimony of others. So we could be right or wrong. The disciples died for what they knew was either true or false. So there's a big difference. Liars make poor martyrs.
I don't think so. I think you can get caught up in a religion. You can get caught up in this thing. And you can believe in God so strongly that I'm going to give my life. I mean, I dedicated my life for all those years. And I suffered somewhat from that, for this belief. And now what I know is a false belief. There is no evidence or good argument for a God, and certainly...
You mean except for the 5 things I presented tonight that you can't answer?
Well, which I rebutted quite clearly. They're pretty weak. They're not even ordinary evidence. So if you want to believe it...
I would disagree with that. I think it's extraordinary.
Well, I don't.
When you have these and there are no plausible naturalistic explanations to account them, I think that makes it pretty strong.
Well, the explanation I give is one possible plausible explanation, and we could come up with others. We don't have to know exactly what happened. All we have to know is that things like this
Would you make it clear what your explanation is?
Well, this is one plausible explanation. That the disciples suffered a radical disconfirmation of their expectations. Peter especially was really going through a trauma. And so to make things right, he prayed, he talked to Jesus in the Spirit, and then Jesus made things okay in his mind, just like what happens with Christians. And then he told his friends and he told everybody, I saw Jesus. And the friend said, oh, well, me too, I'm going to pray. Yes, I saw Jesus. Oh, me too, I'm going to pray. Yes, that's what happens in churches all the time. Yes, it happened to me. Yes,
so that
praise
explains
God.
The beliefs of the disciples, but it doesn't explain Paul, because he's not wanting to see the risen Jesus. It doesn't explain James, who's not wanting to see it, and it doesn't explain the empty tomb.
Well, okay, they could all have different explanations. Paul saw something totally different.
Yeah, so,
I mean, it was a totally different thing.
If we can expand the causes of hallucinations to anything at will, so everybody's hallucinating the risen Jesus for whatever reason you want.
I don't think it was a hallucination.
I don't call that a plausible.
It was not a hallucination. It was like an inner experience. Like when I used to pray, I used to think God was talking to me. I wasn't hearing a real hallucinatory voice, but I thought the Holy Spirit was talking to me. And I would have told you that Jesus was talking to me. And you would not have understood that as a physical voice, as a hallucination, but as an internal religious spiritual experience, right? So what could have happened back there was similar. These people who were devout believers in God were praying, and they're having these religious experiences in their mind. And not necessarily a hallucination, but next Sunday, on Easter Sunday, you're going to have hundreds and thousands of Christians agreeing that the Spirit of Jesus is with them in that room, right? They're going to all testify to that together. There's a kind of drama mentality that happens in religion where we all get on the same page and let's all agree, yes, he spoke to me too. And so that kind of thing happens now. Something like that could have happened then. And as Thomas Paine said, as long as we do have some pretty plausible explanations for the origins of a myth or a legend, then it is irresponsible to jump to a supernatural conclusion. You just don't have the goods there. You might have a faith, but you don't have the evidence.
I would agree with you that if...
Allow you to change the subject if you like for our last few minutes.
All right. I just want to change the subject one way here. Do you agree with me that the number of extraordinary events in the resurrection narrative of Matthew and Luke is greater than the number of extraordinary events in the resurrection narratives of Paul and Mark? The number of the events.
I would say in Paul, and I would say that the bulk of scholarship would be behind me on this, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 in that creed is not producing a resurrection narrative. That's not his intent. His intent is to answer the question posited by the Corinthian church: is there life after death? Are Christians, do we have an immortal soul? And in doing so, what he does is he lists a number of eyewitnesses who said, we saw the risen Jesus, and that happened to both individuals, to groups, to friends, and to foes. And then he says, basically, because Christ lives, we will live as well. So his intent in 1 Corinthians 15 is not to produce a resurrection narrative. So to turn around and say we've got evolution because Paul didn't say this full-blown resurrection account in 1 Corinthians 15, I think would be putting the theological cart before the horse. And when it comes to Mark, no, I wouldn't agree with, we've got some things like in Matthew and Luke and John that would be like guards, the earthquakes.
Earthquakes, angels.
No. I think we've got angels in Mark.
We have one young man who might be an angel. Notice something else. You agree with me that as the time passes, the number of angels increases. Right? It starts with one young man, then it's one angel, then it's two young men, then it's two angels. You agree that as time passes, that number increases.
I agree that the numbers listed in the Gospels will change from 1 to 2. However, I don't think that necessarily means a contradiction there.
But you agree that there's a growth, at least in the telling, not necessarily in the facts, but in the telling.
I don't know that I would even agree with that, Dan, because number one, when it comes to this young man in Mark, you look in the ancient writings, and on multiple occasions, both in the Jewish Apocrypha as well as the New Testament, men and young men on many occasions are referred to as...
Yeah, I agree with that. It's possible that he was referring to what he thought was an angel.
In fact, in Luke, it's a good example. In Luke chapter 24, I think it's verse 4, he calls it young men, or men, who were there announcing in this bright gleaming clothing, men. And then in verse 23, just a few verses later, he calls them angels. So they understood him in that sense. The fact that they're wearing bright clothes is used very frequently in antiquity to refer to divine beings. So I don't see any contradiction whatsoever, because some gospels say men are young men and the others say angels. And then as far as the 2 and 1, hey, where you've got 2, you've got 1.
Well, okay, but I'm just saying in the telling, in the actual document itself, there is an increase over time. Maybe that's not a contradiction, but you do agree that as the documents pass through the decades, the number of extraordinary events and the number of angels does increase across time. You might explain it some way, but there is a pattern of an ascension, an increase in extraordinary events as we get further and further away from the original. Well, what about the Gospel of Peter? What do you think of that?
Well, the Gospel of Peter, it's interesting. Yeah, you look at the resurrection account in that, and you find it's very embellished. Yeah. You find these guys come to the tomb on Easter morning. All of Jerusalem's out there to see it. The bright light comes down. The stone rolls itself away. These 2 angels come down, go in the tomb, come out of the tomb. Their heads go up to the clouds. Jesus' head goes above the cloud. The cross comes hopping out of the tomb. The voice comes out of heaven and says, "Did you preach to them that sleep?" And the cross says, "Yes, I did." So, this is obviously a lot different than what we find in the Gospels.
But it is embellished, right? And did it come
Absolutely.
early? Was that written early or was that written late?
Well, we have no evidence at all that the Gospel of Peter came before the 3rd century. So, with
So
the
it was
Gospels,
late.
Sure.
Well, the Westar Institute puts it maybe at 85 to 100.
But the
it doesn't
Westar
matter.
Institute, the Jesus Seminar, just so everybody knows here, these are a group of very highly critical scholars that are almost as on the far end spectrum, the left spectrum of the theological left as you can go. You can only go a little further than that, and that's like where Bob Price stands, and maybe five scholars in the whole world who deny the existence of Jesus.
And what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that? What's wrong with being a critical scholar?
I don't think there's anything wrong, and I think Bob Price is a very smart guy, but I think that there's good reasons to believe in this data that I've presented here tonight, because it is well evidenced. And just because you quote some of these guys on the far end of the theological left, well, they're on the far end, they're on the fringe. And so quoting a few guys, it'd be like saying, all right, well, this is what democracy should be like. And you say, well, no, it isn't. Here's what a few neo-Nazis said. I'm not saying these guys are neo-Nazis. I don't mean to imply that. But say, well, here's what a few neo-Nazis say. Well, fine, I'm glad to know what they believe, but I'll tell you what, I'll stick with mainline.
These are 75 plus biblical scholars who know the languages, who have a PhD or an equivalent in the languages and in the study and in the cultures of the time, who are not beholden to any religious group. They are independent scholars. Yep. They're not speaking for the Episcopal Church or for an evangelical. These are scholars who want to know what's true. And not only do they give their opinions, they give their reasons.
Yeah, but let's look at, for the most part, as anyone who wants to read the debate between Bill Craig and John Dominic Crossan, I think is very telling. He has an anti-supernatural bias.
No, he doesn't. John Crossan does not.
Absolutely, because Craig, in the period like we're having here, he asked Crossan, he says, do you believe God exists? Well, it's irrelevant. Well, during the Jurassic period, he says, do you believe that it's factually true that God exists? And Crossan said, well, no, I don't believe that. So he comes to the table with atheistic beliefs to begin with. Of course you rule out the miraculous.
Crossan is not an atheist. You're wrong about that. I've read some of his works, and he does allow for miracles.
Okay, so he doesn't believe God existed during the Jurassic period, and he's a theist?
He believes in God now.
Yeah, but he believes in God in the sense that we believe in the American spirit. Well, there's no spirit, let's say, in America. We believe in the ideals of the American spirit. And it's the same thing with, like we might believe in the spirit of Santa Claus, as Craig said, but we don't literally believe that there is a Santa Claus. And likewise, Crossan says, he believes in God in the sense that he thinks it's a nice idea, but he doesn't believe that God factually exists.
Well, I don't either.
He says that very clearly in that debate.
I don't either. And why does that make you wrong? I mean, what's wrong with not believing? Why not come at it as an outsider, as a critic, rather than as a loyal believer who's trying to prove? Wouldn't you rather trust the outside critics than the inside critics? The outside critics would be rather to be trusted than those who are a part of the established authority of doctrine.
And that's why I like what Ludemann and all the, many of these critics who don't believe in the resurrection grant these 5 facts that I've given tonight.
When did Ludemann write that quote that you read?
That was in the 90s. I think it was 96.
Because, he became an atheist just recently, like about 3 or 4 years ago.
Yes, he did.
And he might have written that back when he was a believer, and his views have changed somewhat since then. He's in Göttingen University.
Well, now he was in that debate with Bill Craig. He became an atheist just after that. So he was toying with atheists at that point.
So Bill Craig turned him into an atheist.
Well, I think as Mark Goodacre over at Birmingham University in the UK says, when you see people like Ludemann, or in his case he cited, I'm trying to think of the scholar that he did a PhD on, Michael Goulder. He says these guys, over time, you can see that they just have this, they're getting tired of considering the miraculous, and they have this emotional bent toward atheism, and they start moving in that direction. And as Goodacre says, it's not a matter of what the head told them, it's the heart's leaning in that direction, and then they use arguments, as I see that you've done, Dan. I see that you're using these arguments from this fringe in order to justify your view. And the assumptions that these are based on, I just don't see them as very rational.
Well, I'm impressed with their scholarship. I really am. I look at it. Most of them are believing Christians.
The Jesus Seminar.
Yeah, I am impressed with their scholarship and their reasons and their evidences and their honesty and their willingness to change their mind. And if any of them do have an atheistic bent, I count that as a plus. Anybody who is willing to buck the status quo, anybody who has enough courage to stand up in this predominantly religious world and say, wait, I'm not going to believe that stuff, no matter what threats of hell are made to me. I have a lot of respect for scholars like that. I just have two more questions, and then maybe we could go into our final. Talking about Paul's formula in 1 Corinthians 15, I think you're wrong about Paul's intent of that. Paul's intent in giving that passage was to establish his credentials with the church in Corinth. He wanted to show them, Peter saw Jesus, James saw Jesus, 500 people saw Jesus, and so did I. So I'm one of the insiders. Because how is he going to be accepted as an insider unless he had some kind of a authenticating experience? So his intent in giving that formula, and by the way, historians will agree that the more formulaic something is, the less narrative it is, then the more legendary it is. And that earliest resurrection account we have in the entire New Testament is in a non-narrative. It's more like a hymn or like a recitation. It's one of the signs of legend when you present things in this sort of hymn-like...
I would disagree with that. I would agree that it's a recitation. It is a creed. It's very noticeable by the parallelism that's in there. But to say it's a legend, you have no evidence for that, and you wouldn't have the consensus of scholarship.
The style is legendary.
Not at all. Why would you say it's legendary? Why would the style be legendary?
Because most legends are given in a kind of poetic, hymn, sing-song, recitative kind of a way. When you tell the legend...
Yeah, but so was the imparting of oral historical tradition, too.
But see,
you got a burden of proof to show it was legend.
But that's one of the arguments a lot of Christian historians give for the authenticity of the New Testament. It is that it's given in a non-legendary frame. It's given in more in a narrative. But here, the earliest resurrection account is given in a non-narrative, in more legendary style.
I'm sorry, and what evidence would you have that it's legend? Because Paul's saying he's an eyewitness.
I'm not saying that it is legend. I'm saying the style is legendary. The earliest thing we have on the resurrection is in a style that is unlike anything else. It's in a legendary, hymn-like, recitative style. And then one last question.
By the way, you wouldn't have much scholarly consensus on that opinion, but go ahead.
Well, I'm just repeating what Christian scholars say.
No, you're repeating what a few of the scholars, and not all of them, of the Jesus Seminar would say.
Okay, so whatever your interpretation, you do agree with me that that style of that formula in the earliest resurrection account is somewhat different from the rest.
In fact, can I read a quote from John Dominic Crossan, of the co-founder of the Jesus Seminar on this? He says, Paul needs in 1 Corinthians 15, in agreement with you here, to equate his own experience with that of the preceding apostles. To equate, that is, its validity and legitimacy, but not necessarily its mode or matter. Paul's own entranced revelation should not be the model for all the others. So not only is Crossan saying here that Paul isn't necessarily saying, and Ludemann would not agree with this, but Crossan here is saying that Paul is not necessarily saying that his experience was just like the disciples. He's saying that the validity and the legitimacy of his experience was the same as the disciples. So he is, according to Crossan, your man here, he's saying that it is historical. He's not saying it's legendary.
He said he appeared also to me. Paul wanted to be, you see his intent. He wanted to be accepted by the church at Corinth. And exactly. One final point, in that earliest...
I'm glad you agree with my view then.
I don't agree with your view. I'm agreeing that...
But you just agreed with Crossan here.
Originally, you gave a different intention for Paul including that in 1 Corinthians. And I'm correcting you and saying that his real intention, as Crossan agrees, was to establish his credentials before his readers of 1,000 miles away who had no idea, knowing who this man was.
Okay.
Quickly, okay. You also agree with me in that in that earliest resurrection account in 1 Corinthians 15, there are no women giving testimony.
That's correct.
Okay.
Again, Paul is not doing a resurrection narrative there, so we wouldn't expect him to do that. He doesn't mention Pontius Pilate. He doesn't mention the thieves. He doesn't mention a number of other events. He doesn't mention that this happened by Pontius Pilate on the eve of the Passover during the reign of Tiberius Caesar, which is mentioned by Tacitus and Josephus. But what we have in the Gospels are resurrection narratives. That's not what Paul's intending to do here.
But you at least agree that they are absent. They could have been there. Peter was there, James was there, and the women could have been there, but they weren't. They're absent from the earliest testimony.
Right, because it's not Paul's intent to give a resurrection
Whatever
narrative.
the reason, they're not there.
Great. So I'm glad you admit that at least all the disciples, Paul and James, believed Jesus rose and appeared to them.
Peter, Paul, and James, if they existed, believed that Jesus rose spiritually to heaven, not bodily.
Okay. Thank you for a very rigorous and okay. Questions for Dan, please use this, questions for Mike, please use this microphone here. Questions for Dan on this side. And I would encourage you, please, to make your questions concise and to a particular point. And I would also encourage the speakers to have your answers do the same so we can field as many questions as possible. Let's start with Mike, since we've been doing that all night.
You said the debate is not up, it's up resurrection, not inerrancy. I think inerrancy is relevant to the evidence for the contradiction between the Gospels. With the authors, do you believe the scriptural accounts of crucifixion and resurrection were related events such as Judas' death are actually consistent with this?
That's a great. Am I on here? I think that's a great question you bring up about inerrancy there. I believe in the inerrancy of the Bible according to the Chicago Statement of Inerrancy. I don't have time to get into that, but you can look that up online through a search engine, Chicago Statement of Inerrancy. And if you look at Article 13 in there, I think it will explain some of what my view would allow in terms of inerrancy. But I don't think, you say, well, what about if there are some tensions in the gospel accounts concerning the resurrection narrative, do these call into question the resurrection itself? And I don't think so. And in fact, Dan himself would admit this, because in his book, Losing Faith in Faith, he makes the statement, he says, do these accounts, he says that what he perceives as contradictions, he says, these do not disprove the resurrection of Jesus. And so that's what we're looking at tonight. We're not dealing with the details of the resurrection narrative, such as how many angels were there, was it one or two, and you're running the stone roll away. These are other details about the accounts. And I think that these can be reconciled for the most part. But even if I'm wrong on that, we're still looking at the thing about with the basic layer of historical truth. And like I mentioned with the burning of Rome, Tacitus and Suetonius, both mention the great fire of Rome, but they differ significantly in the details regarding the event. Nevertheless, we can still believe the fire itself occurred. So even if all of the purported contradictions that they would have in gospel resurrection accounts, even if they were valid, and I don't think that they are, it really wouldn't matter, because the 5 minimal facts that I presented, the 5 facts tonight, still stand.
Do I have a chance to respond to the question?
Maybe the resurrection contradictions don't disprove the resurrection, but they do throw serious doubt on the credibility of these reports. In a court of law, that's exactly what you would do to a testimony. You would cross-examine. You would see if a testimony had contradictions within it. And when you see, I have 17 contradictions here that are really good. Matthew said the women came to the tomb when the sun had risen, but John said when it was dark. Different list of women. Different purposes were given. Was the tomb open when they arrived? Matthew says no, but the others say yes. Who was at the tomb? Different angels, situated in different places. What were the messages? Different messages were given. Did the women tell what happened afterwards? In one case it said yes, but in another case it said no, they didn't. When did Mary first see Jesus? Was it before or after she returned to the disciples? Could Jesus be touched after the resurrection? Where did Jesus first appear to the disciples? Was it on a mountain in Galilee, or was it in a room in Jerusalem? On and on and on and on. We see that under cross-examination, these witnesses would be seriously compromised in their reliability. If they're wrong about this, if they're so sloppy on the supposedly most important document to the world, then what else can we throw at them? I mean, you have to admit it is a pretty sloppy way to get an important message.
I agree with a lot of those alleged contradictions that you've just named.
Yeah, my question was, you had made a couple of references to the fact of Peter being a liar, and at one point you'd use that as a reasonable enough
fact that to denounce his claim altogether. I was just wondering how you could put faith in those claims at all. How do you know that Peter was a liar?
I didn't really hear. Did you understand what he was saying?
I didn't understand it either.
How about this? Yeah. You had made a reference a couple times to Peter being a liar, and one time used that as reason enough to not believe in his claim. I was wondering how you yourself believe or have put faith in the fact that Peter was a liar.
How did I put faith? Well, if you believe the document, if you believe the story that's given in the New Testament, Peter told an admitted lie that everyone knows was a lie. Now, if you don't believe the document, then we can throw the whole thing out, which would be fine with me. I mean, it's a nice story about how this legend started. But you either take the document at face value or you don't. Peter told a lie. We all admit that. Our first witness to the resurrection was an admitted liar just a couple days before that, who was under mental stress, under trauma. He was a hot-headed guy. He cut off a soldier's ear. He was rash. He was uneducated. I mean, is he the kind of guy you would want to have on a witness stand for an important criminal trial? I don't think so.
Then would you acknowledge the fact that Jesus made a claim before Peter made those lies, that he predicted that would go ahead and happen?
So Jesus predicted that Peter would lie?
It says so in all four Gospels, just like it says so about Peter lying, which I'm assuming
So,
that's
so
where
Peter
you
had no choice? He had to lie?
Well, I mean, he made the claim, and it would seem that Jesus is an extraordinary person. That's why we're all here, right?
Well, okay, even if he had the gift of prophecy, it doesn't change the fact that Peter's responsible for his own actions, right? And if Jesus knew that he had such poor character that he was going to lie, and he said so, that still doesn't help Peter's credibility as a witness. His credibility is severely compromised. He's a liar.
And he knew that if he were to admit to it in that very moment, that he probably too would find himself up on a cross, and that would probably be reason, because at that point they hadn't had enough belief, right? The sign hadn't been fulfilled, that if Jesus were to rise from the dead, then they would put their faith, and at that point he was still maybe a little skeptical.
Well, then Jesus didn't do a very good job of instructing his disciples, did he? They couldn't even stick with him after all these years of training. They didn't have enough faith in his teachings and his example. And he's not a very good leader then, is he?
Right. At the end, it is about faith, right? And you yourself have put your faith in your belief, just like Peter had to figure out how to do
No,
this.
I don't have a faith in it. I'm saying taking it at face value. It's probably false. The story is probably false. But if we're going to take that story as testimony, then we also have to take the other testimony that compromises the testimony.
Let's give Mike a chance at that.
It seems to me, I think it's kind of interesting, your question there. It seems to me that Dan is approaching a cafeteria approach to the Bible, that you pick and choose what you want. I mean, on the one hand, you talk about discrepancies in the Bible and the resurrection account, so let's just throw out the whole thing. It's just all or nothing. But on the other side of your mouth, you're saying Peter's a liar. Well, if you're going to reject all of it because of the discrepancies in the Gospels, why would you accept the part of Peter lying? It seems like that just takes out the foundation for your objection to Peter being a liar. And then I also say that this thing about liar, I think it's so overblown, Dan. I mean, come on, the guy was facing torture and execution, but the fact is he repented and he followed Jesus for the next 30 plus years, served as head of the church, had a tremendous impact. I mean, we've all made mistakes in our lives, no question about it. It's being able to pick ourselves up, brush the dust off, go with the forgiveness of God, and move ahead, and that's especially what Peter did. I think rather than looking at him as a bad witness, we ought to look at him as a good example about a guy who fell face down in his Christian life, accepted the forgiveness of Christ, and went forward.
I have a short comment and then a question for Mike. Due to medieval history, there were at least 36 pre-Jesus gods that were born of a virgin mother. They died and they rose from the dead. At least 36 of them. Now the question is, according to history, how could this mythical Jesus have been crucified if he died in 3 hours and rose in 3 days, when it took at least 6 days of torture and pain before death would come on crucifixion? Furthermore, he would not have been impaled by a spear. That would not have been a true crucifixion. So how could this Jesus have been crucified and still, it only took 3 hours. I mean, they were supposed to hang on these crosses for at least 6 or 7 days. But Jesus was something different. But there was a whole line of guys being crucified at the same time, I understand. Okay.
Thank you for your comment and question, first of all. In terms of the dying and rising gods in mythology, I would say that some good studies have been done on that. Gunther Wagner in his Pauline Baptism and the Pagan Mysteries. Edwin Yamauchi has done some studies, so has Bruce Metzger. Gary Habermas has done some study, Resurrection Claims in Non-Christian Religions. And in an article published, I believe, last year in Philosophy Christi, he replied to Evan Fales with some information about that. Bottom line is this: with the exception of Osiris, there isn't a single account of a dying and rising God that precedes Christianity. They all come after the writing of the New Testament. And this has been documented in those works. Now, I'd also say, in terms of the crucifixion, I think that Jesus was on the cross for 6 hours, if I remember right. But even if that's the case, you're right. Jesus did seem to die quite ahead of time, sooner than most crucifixion victims did. I don't know 6 or 7 days would be common. In my study in crucifixion, I didn't find anything. It would say days, but it didn't say how many. And it was a very, very brutal process, I agree. But if you recall, the Jews of the period, according to the New Testament accounts, and in fact, according to the Talmud, it says he was hanged on the eve of the Passover. And again, the New Testament Gospels have that as well. If that's the case, the Jews would have been correct in saying they don't want him hanging on the cross. And so they would have, like the Gospel said, went and did the Crurifragium, breaking the legs, which was a method described. And the reason they would do that is so the person couldn't push up against their feet, which had been nailed, in order to exhale and inhale, and they would simply asphyxiate. So that would also explain the point you bring up. It would explain why Pilate was surprised when Joseph of Arimathea went to him and requested the body. He was surprised that he had died already.
Let me just respond real quickly to the thing about the pagan parallels. In the 2nd century, in the year 150, there was a Christian apologist who wrote these words to the pagans. Listen to this. When we Christians say that the Word, who is the firstborn of God, was produced without sexual union, and that He, Jesus Christ our teacher, was crucified and died and rose again and ascended into heaven, we propound nothing different from what you pagans believe regarding those whom you esteem sons of Jupiter. Here is a 2nd century Christian telling the pagans that what we are proclaiming is nothing different from what you pagans believe. And you admit that Osiris was one of those who was written before. But
But it's not really a resurrection.
But the dating of the writings doesn't mean that those things were not believed before that time. Dionysus was a god who died and rose again. Mithra was another one who had 12 disciples and who had a Last Supper with his 12 disciples, who was cut from a rock and who died and rose from the dead. So that you can see that the Jesus, and that wasn't a major part of my argument tonight, but you can see that the Jesus legend is cut from the same fabric as all these other myths and legends. Anybody who was anybody in those days was born of a virgin and ascended to heaven. Even Augustus Caesar, Suetonius wrote that Caesar Augustus ascended to heaven when he died. I mean, it was really a mark of honor to be somebody who ascended to heaven. So that's a strike against the uniqueness of the Christian message.
I don't think so, because when he said he ascended to heaven, he's talking about Augustus. Suetonius says that there was one person who believed, he swore he saw Augustus ascending in the flames. And, as you know, he mentions a similar account about Julius Caesar being in a comet and going to heaven that way. But these are easily explained by naturalistic explanations, a comet or a hallucination. And Suetonius would even say the comet himself, you can't explain that with the resurrection. There are no plausible naturalistic explanations.
I just gave you a few tonight.
I didn't hear
It's
it.
up to you to decide if they're plausible. For me, they are very plausible.
All right. My question, can you hear me? For Dan.
There. Okay. One of your arguments against the resurrection is that there's little to no eyewitness testimony of evidence for the resurrection, right? Is that correct?
Of the resurrection itself.
Right. Okay. if that's the case, if the resurrection was a lie, if it's like the greatest hoax of all time, or a great hoax, what eyewitness evidence, what credible eyewitness evidence do you have that Christ did not raise, and who was bringing this evidence? Where were they, and where's the written documents of this evidence, and why weren't at least some believers, and maybe some of the disciples, speaking out against about this, if they knew it was a lie, if they're credible people at all? Maybe one of them or some of them might have spoke out against it.
They were a fanatical religious sect. They were people who traveled the country behind a religious teacher. They left their homes. These were people, they were uneducated, most of them, of a mindset to follow this Messiah. And so they were primed to believe anything that would help further their cause that they had dedicated themselves to. It's not my job to prove a negative. I would ask, if this message is so important, if there really is a God and he really wants us to know that Jesus died and rose from the dead, why doesn't he do it again? Why doesn't he do it now when we have video cameras? Why doesn't he go on Oprah Winfrey and say, hey, I died and I'm back again? Why do we have to rely on this ancient, distant, misty, unreliable historical testimony that we can't even agree on, and you even admit it could be contradictory in some places and still be true? I would ask, if it's so important, why don't we know it for sure? We don't know it for sure. You don't know it for sure. You believe it because as a Christian you want to be on the bandwagon with other Christians because it's a good thing, but you don't know what happened. You weren't there.
Okay, there we are. I mean, I'm not on, okay, for one thing, I don't feel like I'm on the bandwagon and trying to go with the other Christians. I disagree with that, and you don't really know what I believe or what I decide, so don't try to do that. But, I mean, yes, there are people who actually believe that it's true for other reasons other than getting on the bandwagon. There might be some of them, too, but there are definitely people who have enough evidence.
Like this? Like what he gave tonight?
Sure, what he gave tonight.
That convinces you?
My whole life, I'm very convinced. But my question to you is, where's your evidence that where are the people who did speak out? Maybe the disciples didn't, but give us some facts. Like Mike gave us a whole bunch of people that weren't Christians who said that they believed that the resurrection happened. Where are the Christians or the people, outside critics who spoke out against the resurrection?
Mike gave us
your credible historical evidence.
Mike gave us no evidence of any first century doubter or critic who questioned or mentioned or even pro or con outside of the testimony of the followers in the New Testament. All he gave us was things from 2nd century and later. And so, and even if we allow for a little bit of Josephus in the year 95, that's really late. So I would say the absence of evidence is evidence of absence. Because if something truly doesn't exist, the only evidence you would have for its non-existence would be a lack of evidence for its existence. So I give to you the lack of evidence of corroborative testimony within the 1st century as my argument. I mean, if there were something, you would have used it, right? You'd be trumpeting it. You'd be saying, look, here's this person who lived in the year 40 who disagreed. You'd be using that, but you don't have it. All you have is the New Testament and a couple of extra canonical books that you like the Gospel of Peter, that you do discard because you think. By the way, who wrote the Gospel of Peter? It was a Christian, right? Had to be a believer, right?
Probably.
Which is evidence that the Christians very early on were tampering with the story. There was that tendency among Christianity to tamper, to edit, to exaggerate. So the very existence of the Gospel of Peter shows that that kind of stuff was going on. Editing, redacting, tampering, exaggerating. That's my evidence.
Yeah, it went on later on, perhaps. But that doesn't mean that that's what was going on in the Gospels. And besides, I really haven't even appealed to the Gospels tonight. My appeal has been to the very early sources, the eyewitness testimony of Paul himself, the early creed in 1 Corinthians 15, the Acts sermon summaries. These are things in which the majority of scholars do agree on. And that's why I'm trying to appeal to this basic layer so we don't get into this thing about legendary development. It's irrelevant in our discussion tonight because it's these other sources which are extremely early and come from the eyewitnesses themselves. So you can accuse them of lying or hallucinating or something, but you can't say it was legend because, again, it goes back to the eyewitnesses themselves. So even though Dan tonight has on a couple occasions said second, third, fourth-hand witness, just a moment ago he said the earliest is 2nd century, that's false. We've got the Apostle Paul that goes back to the 1st century, said he saw Jesus. We've got the Creed that's dated within 5 years of the crucifixion. We've got the sermon summaries that scholars normally date within 15 to 20 years of the crucifixion. These are very early.
But they're in the New Testament. That was my point.
Certainly.
They are New Testament documents.
Yeah.
There's nothing outside the New Testament.
Well, I mentioned a couple. You've got Josephus, and you're saying he's late, but he's still growing up. He could have certainly, he's in a position to be an eyewitness to
So
the
that
disciples'
passage
claim
about
to
Jesus,
stuff.
that passage, you agree that that passage about Jesus that appears in Josephus does not appear before the 4th century. That passage is absent from his antiquities before the 4th century, the time of Eusebius.
No, not at all. In fact, but the passage I refer to had to do with the stoning of James, which is in Book 20, Section 200.
But we're talking about the resurrection.
Right, but I was saying the stoning of James, because James was willing to die for his belief. That's where I used Josephus. Now, if you want to refer to the Testimonium Flavianum in Book 18, Section 3, I would agree with the majority of Josephus scholars today that there are some Christian interpolations in that passage, maybe as many as 3. However, the passage itself, the majority of critics, according to Louis Feldman, he told me this personally, and Louis Feldman is the leading, he's a Jewish scholar, he's not a Christian, and he's the leading Josephus scholar in the world. He told me personally that 3 to 1, perhaps even as high as 5 to 1, Josephus scholars today believe that that passage, in that passage, Josephus is aware of Jesus. And he mentioned several things about him.
So you're agreeing that Christians tampered with historical documents?
Yes, I would
They did.
agree with that. In terms of Josephus, that did happen. We don't know when it happened, but the whole thing is we go back to that historical core, and we can see Josephus does mention Jesus.
So
And that's what I'm appealing to tonight.
So Christians did tamper with the evidence?
And
He
legend
admits.
is not necessarily a thing, because we can go back to this basic layer of historical truth. That's what I'm saying.
All right. My question was, you talk about, or you had the 5 points that you made, or 5 basic points to support the resurrection, right? I just wanted to clarify, one of the points that you made was that there were a lot of scholars endorsed these 5 points, including even some, who weren't Christians, who were atheists and who didn't believe in the resurrection, right?
Yes.
Doesn't the fact that they believe the 5 points and yet still don't believe in the resurrection, doesn't that kind of hurt your argument to a small extent? I mean, where does that fit in? Like, you're endorsing the 5 points, but at the same time there are people who endorse the 5 points but who don't agree with the resurrection. How does that conflict? I don't know.
I think that's an excellent question you ask, and I appreciate you asking it. I think it's a very fair question. Why is it that these scholars who are non-believers, even atheists, can agree with the 5 points I've presented tonight and yet not come to the conclusion of resurrection? I think this is what we're looking at, and this is in terms of historiography and how we draw conclusions, and this is what my PhD work is on. And basically, you have these different kind of conclusions. What I'm saying, and the argument I presented tonight is, when you have a number of people, you got the fact, and because this is well evidenced and granted by virtually all critics who study the subject, even the skeptical ones, you got Jesus' death by crucifixion, you got the fact that afterward a number of people said they saw him in groups and to individuals, to friends, to foes, and finally the fact that there are no plausible naturalistic explanations. And I'll agree with Dan, that's going to be up to you guys to determine on your own whether or not his naturalistic explanations are plausible. I could say they're implausible, he could say they're plausible. You have to determine for yourself. I can say by and far the majority of critics today reject most of the naturalistic explanations or the ones that Dan has presented. By far the majority of critics today are in a position where they say, like Paula Fredrickson of Boston University, hey, they saw something, but I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw. I can't say whether or not it was a resurrection, but I do know that they saw something, and that's where they stopped. I think we can go further than that. And in the absence of any plausible naturalistic explanations, I see no reason for concluding that Jesus rose from the dead. But I think it's an excellent question you asked.
There's nothing implausible about the explanation that I offered. I'm not saying it was true, but the explanation that I gave is perfectly plausible. You agree that it happens in human cultures. You agree that legends and myths start. The explanation I gave today is perfectly plausible in naturalistic terms. You might reject it, but you cannot say it is an implausible explanation. They believed that Jesus spiritually ascended to heaven. not bodily. That is plausible, right?
The problem is we've already looked at what the Greek and everything says there in the other passages, and no, I think based on the Greek in those passages, it's implausible.
At this point, there was a momentary break in taping in order to change tapes. As a result, one question and the majority of Mike's answer were omitted. The questioner directed his question to both Mike and Dan. The question was, is it possible to obtain unbiased information? We have asked Mike to reproduce his answer to the best of his recollection.
I admit that, just as today, virtually every author in antiquity carried his own personal biases and interests. But that doesn't mean that we can't arrive at any historical conclusions. The Oxford University historian A.N. Sherwin-White wrote that it is the role of the professional historian to comb through the data, identify biases, compare the data with other accounts, and identify kernels of historical truth in those accounts. Sherwin-White says that the historian can locate these kernels in the worst of third-hand sources. I'll add, though, that we have something very strong with the testimonies of Paul and James. Before believing that the risen Jesus had appeared to each of them, Paul was out persecuting the church, and James, a pious Jew, apparently wanted no part in what his brother Jesus was doing. Then suddenly they did a complete about-face and became Christian leaders who died willingly for their faith because they sincerely believed that Jesus had appeared to them risen from the dead. Now it's easy to miss grasping how profound these testimonies are. I think an equivalent scenario today would be to hear that someone like Osama bin Laden begins preaching on the streets of Pakistan. Brothers, hear me. What I did in leading terror was wrong. And then he goes on to say that while hiding in the mountains of Afghanistan, Jesus appeared to him and told him he was following a false religion and that Jesus was the Messiah and risen Son of God. Imagine him giving such a public testimony and that he continued to do so until he's finally martyred for his newfound Christian faith. That's pretty much what we have with Paul. Now, James isn't quite as dramatic, but he might be like a serious and upstanding rabbi today who all of a sudden becomes a Christian because he believes the risen Jesus appeared to him. That's what we have with Paul and James. So I think that we have some very good testimony that would be unbiased to begin with.
Did you want to ask your question again and see if Dan would like to respond?
Do you think that it's possible to get unbiased information on a subject with such a dichotomy as this?
Yes, it is. I was a true believer. I preached the resurrection of Jesus. I put my life on the line for Jesus, and I lived the Christian life. And as I read the scholarship, as I read the reasonings that are given by the critical scholars, I looked at the unbiased, open historical evidence, I changed my mind. It's possible to do that. It's painful psychologically, but I would rather go with the truth than to pretend to believe in some pie-in-the-sky myth that will make me live forever or whatever. I'd rather go with the truth than with the lies of history.
So I guess like now when both of you, you're looking for evidence, now is that evidence valid? That you obviously both have distinct views?
Well, we're looking at the same facts, but we're looking at it different ways.
Are you asking if we have personal biases?
Well, obviously you do.
Sure.
So then when you look at, because I mean, several times now you've had the same thing and you both had completely different views on it. So, I mean, it seems that that should just not be valid then. Because
Well, that's human nature. History is interpretive. History is the weakest of all the sciences. Of all the legitimate sciences, history gives us knowledge that is less confidence than any other science. We do have confidence at some level, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60%. But the information we get through history is much less secure than the information we get through other sciences. So there has to be...
Except psychology.
That's not a legitimate science.
In regards to that, I think they're proving now Newton's laws of thermodynamics incorrect through astronomical data of dark matter, but that's another story altogether. What I wanted to ask was, you referred to the point that Christ was more likely impaled on a pole than he was crucified on a cross, and I was just wondering where you got the data for that.
Okay, I don't think that's an important point. I really don't. He was publicly executed in some way, right? That's all that Christians care about. He was public. What does the shape have to do with it? If it turns out that it was a stake, it wouldn't change anybody's faith. He still died and rose from the dead, right? But that word stavros in the Greek is where we get the word staff. It's a stake. It's an impaled, like a skewer. And there is no Christian art that has any T-shaped Roman cross in it before the 5th century. Before then, Jesus was like a shepherd or a fisherman. The idea of a T-shaped method of execution came later in Christianity. And in fact, Roman custom was that people would be publicly stuck up on a stick or on a pole. And some of them might have had some crossbeams in that, but Christians in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century weren't talking about the cross, the T-shaped cross then. It only came later after coming in contact with Tammuz, the pagan god Tammuz, which did have that Tau symbol, the T-shaped. And then we start seeing that Christian cross around the 6th or 7th century. So, but I don't think it matters. If it was a T-shaped cross, it doesn't change my argument at all. I was just throwing that out as should it matter what the shape was?
Is this on? Okay, now it's on again. I think that the cross does matter. This is just why I'm bringing it up, because of the fact that if the cross was incorrect, then the whole biblical resurrection would be more likely incorrect, because the cross is a key point to Christ's death and resurrection. And I'm also wondering now on the fact that Peter was crucified upside down, and there's other data outside of biblical reference that refers to that. So if crosses weren't existent until the 4th, 5th century, then how could Peter have been crucified upside down?
Upside down, right side up, so what? There is no word cross in the New Testament. That's an English word. The word is stavros, and that does not refer to a T-shaped instrument of execution. That's just the word stavros. You might think it's a T-shaped cross, but why is that important? He was executed on something, right? So it might be important to show that today these crosses you see on top of churches, it's an imposter, but it doesn't matter. It's come to represent what modern Christians think is the symbol of their religion. The steeple and the spire itself are borrowed from paganism. They're phallic symbols, piercing the heaven. There's no steeples, there's no spires, there's no crosses in the Bible itself. This is later Christian tradition that's built upon what you believe.
I would agree with Dan on two things there. Number one, I would agree that the Greek word stelros does not necessarily refer to a T. It is used of many different things. In fact, it's even used not only of a stake, but it's used of the stockades that Peter's feet were put in Acts when he was in jail. So there's nothing in that Greek word that would imply a cross. I would also have to agree with Dan that the shape of the cross wouldn't have anything to do in impacting the resurrection, because if I remember correctly, I don't believe the Gospels say that it was a T. That comes from medieval paintings. However, I do believe that Dan is mistaken in his facts once again when he says that there is no reference to T-shaped cross prior to the 6th or 7th century. Two early writers, Barnabas and Lucian, who write between the year 70 and 135, both mention how the cross was patterned after the Greek letter tau, or which is RT. Moreover, you've got gemstones that date from the 2nd and 3rd century that archaeologists discovered, which they were ancient jewelry, and they depicted Jesus crucified, and they showed the crossbeam. You also have graffiti that dates to the middle part of the 3rd century, which depicts a crossbeam as well. So I think he is...
Crossbeam, I've seen that.
No, it's like this. It's like the T. Now, in terms of Peter being crucified upside down, we do have that, I believe, from Clement of Alexandria, who writes around the year 210 to 220, something like that. But his death is mentioned earlier by Clement of Rome in the year 95, but he doesn't mention the manner of his death. So, again, I would agree with Dan on two of the things, and I would disagree with him on the shape of the cross. But I would agree with you that it's irrelevant.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Hi, I think I got kind of a comment for both of you and a question, so just give me a second. I wanted to give you a little more credit than I think people are giving you, because you're arguing completely within the bounds of Christian mythology to negate it without having to stretch to whether God exists at all, because that is another huge problem for Christianity or for anything. Christianity is a religion that believes it's right, and that's one of my huge problems with it, because I think you gave a little undue credit to the situation of Paul falling off his horse, seeing the actual physical, whether it be the post-physical or pre-physical body. It's still different, and if, it just seems much more likely that it was not, actual physical. And if you're saying that it was actual physical, heaven physical, then it's still not a natural, explanation. It's not actual, physical body. It's a heavenly body. And I think, again, that since Christianity is something that believes it's completely right, and he did offer a completely plausible naturalistic explanation, which was, people lie, people exaggerate, and that you can't say that's not a very good possibility. And, with that, it throws a huge shadow of doubt over whether it is right, not necessarily whether, we should believe it's right.
I appreciate your comments. I would say in terms of, again, and what Dan did offer to say they lied, they exaggerated, the fact that they were all willing to go to their deaths for this, I think would indicate that they really weren't intentionally lying about this. And the fraud hypothesis has been rejected by nearly every single scholar out there today for that reason. Moreover, even if the disciples were lying, that would have been the first thing that Paul and James would have suspected. I mean, today, you all remember David Koresh. Well, what if it was all of a sudden reported? He predicted his resurrection, by the way. And what if David Koresh's dental remains and skeletal remains from the fire were turned up missing? Well, none of us would think that he rose from the dead. We would say that someone stole the remains. Well, likewise, that would have been the first thing that Paul and James, and Paul especially, that they would have jumped to the conclusion of. Nevertheless, both of them claim that they experienced a post-mortem appearance of Jesus. So the fraud theory just really fails. And in terms of Paul with this appearance, we should lay that to rest. That is in Acts. Paul never mentions that in his writings. It's only mentioned in Acts 2, 22, and 26. So if we're going to talk about Acts, great, because there's enough in there where we can say others did see the light. And I know Dan disagrees, but the majority of critics are going to say that, yeah, they also heard the voice, but they didn't understand it. So there were multiple people there. So you couldn't say that he's experiencing some extra mentally, or an event that was not extra mental, like in a hallucination or a subjective vision of a sort. And if you go to Acts chapter 13, since we are talking about Paul, and we're granting the appearances to Paul in Acts here, if we're going to do that, Paul is very clear in Acts 13 when he's preaching and he says, Jesus died and was buried, so was King David, but David's body decayed in his grave. On the other hand, Jesus' body did not decay in the grave, and he cites Psalm chapter 2, I think it's verse 8, to show that Jesus' body not decaying in the grave was a fulfillment of prophecy. And he says, but he rose up and there were eyewitnesses to this. You couldn't get any more clearer than that Paul believed in bodily resurrection. And again, the majority of critics today would agree that regardless of what Paul saw in the sky, he believed Jesus rose from the dead, and that Paul did believe in bodily resurrection.
Those men who were with Paul did not testify. We don't have their names, we don't have their words. We have Paul saying this and Luke saying that. So we don't have independent corroboration of what happened. Another possibility, may or may not be true, is that Paul was struck by lightning. And the people who were with him would have seen a light and heard a loud noise, and Paul would have been struck blind and had to recuperate for a while. That's a natural possibility.
They didn't understand the voice of the lightning?
Well, the sound, that word phone can be the sound. When Jesus said, I stand at the door and knock, if you hear the knock, he used that word phoneme, right? It doesn't necessarily be a voice, but a sound. So that is a possibility that he was struck by lightning and what happens when he was kind of an unstable guy when you read his writings. I mean, the things he talked about his attitude towards women and all, he's kind of a weird guy. So a man like that, who's going to persecute people, who's going to be struck by lightning, who could have a religious experience, that's plausible. I mean, that's naturalistic. We can't go back and recreate it, but things like that could happen.
It's hard to say, though. I mean, you've given myths, or you're wanting to continue on, and then Paul struck by lightning. What happened to James?
Well, we have somebody
We've got
else.
this really neat combination theory that's coming together here.
We
it
don't
seems
have
like.
James telling us what happened. I mean, we don't have the story, right? We have somebody later, in later years, writing this down. So
We've got the creed in
So
1
James-
Corinthians 15. We've
James
got
may-
Paul going to Galatia, and he says he talked to Peter the Hysteresai, and he met James there, so he would have known from James
yeah,
personally.
but James may have believed, just like the World Trade Center bombers believed in what they were doing. James may have been a true believer. It's possible. Yeah.
Hello, hey. Just for the last 4 questions, ask that you make it real quick. One question, and then the debaters get
Okay.
a little bit.
I think we don't want to rebuttal. I think that's what we don't want to do. Okay, I have a question more for you and then a comment. In the beginning, when you were talking about the resurrection, you had stated that it wasn't extraordinary, and part of that was because the disciples didn't act as if it was an extraordinary thing, that when they stated that Jesus was resurrected, they kind of were like, no, he didn't, and they didn't treat it as something extraordinary. And then later on, you go on to say that part of why the resurrection story took off was because the people over-exaggerated because of their religious fervor. Now, I might be misinterpreting this, but it seems like you're using 2 different lines of reasoning, and one saying that they didn't act appropriate as it being extraordinary, and then one saying that they over-exaggerated and where religious fervor is what was propagating the resurrection. And God is going to have Jesus come back. It says so in Revelation, and we do have TV cameras, so we'll be able to catch it the second time.
Well, you. Well, I'll believe it when I see it. I will only say, I used to preach that sermon, so I know how you feel. I know exactly how you feel, but if the resurrection of Jesus was so powerful to them, and if it really happened, why did they wait 49 days before they started talking about it, Why wouldn't they get out right away? Why did they have to wait for some religious fervor thing to happen to them, on the day of Pentecost when they were filled with the Spirit and spoke in tongues and did all that kind of stuff? If that had happened to me, I would have started talking immediately. I would have started telling all my friends, hey, we were right, he was right, he rose from the dead. I wouldn't have waited those 49 days. But we got to move on, huh?
Is it on? All right. Well, I've been up here for a while and I've been listening, so I kind of lost my train of thought. But the apostles and the disciples were followers of Jesus, and you would agree with me that they'd want other people to listen to their teachings and everything, right? In saying that, why? All right. Sorry. I'm bad at this. I'm sorry. So if they're gonna write a book a couple of years later, the Bible, would they put in negative things about Jesus or things disproving Jesus into the book if they wanted people to read it and follow Jesus?
That's a good question. I do think that they did put in a couple of things in there. One of the things I mentioned about the criteria of enemy attestation a few moments ago, another one of the criteria is the criterion of embarrassment. And we applied that to the empty tomb with the women, that would have been embarrassing to first century Christians. So that's why most critics today would say it wasn't an invention. The empty tomb tradition wasn't an invention, because if it was, they wouldn't do something that was embarrassing. The same thing for things like, the disciples themselves are saying they didn't believe, and that would seem to discredit them as witnesses, because here Jesus had told them, and they just come across, if they're writing the Gospels, they're the ones portraying themselves as a bunch of knuckleheads, because Jesus had told them on a number of occasions, I'm going to rise from the dead, I'm going to rise from the dead, and they're not even expecting it. So that's a thing. You've got the same kind of criteria embarrassment in terms of the claim of Jesus to be the uniquely divine Son of God in Mark 13:32, where he says he doesn't know when he's coming back again. The scholars look at those things and they'll say, wow, well, there's no way that Christians would have invented that and put it into the text, so it must be an authentic saying of Jesus. So did that answer your question? Kind of? Yeah, I'm sorry. I think it was a good one, though, whatever. Sure. I appreciate your waiting, though. And if you want to talk afterwards, I'll be around.
Hi. I sort of have a quick questions for both of you. Let me first let you know where I'm coming from. I'm a Muslim, okay? So there is basically where my questions are coming from. So for you then, I guess that a lot of your arguments were that the text that we have, the statements that we have are contradicting one another, are coming much, much later than the event they describe actually happened. However, the Quran, the Book of Muslims, is written, and it is as is from the day that it was written, and there is no much controversy about that. Have you taken a look there? If not, sort of to know about it, just to say what they say about Jesus, what they say. We have a tremendous respect for Jesus, as you probably know, just as a prophet. And then my question for you, Mike, is as far as I know, and I might be wrong on that, but as late as the 300 AD, there were still controversy in, for example, the Nicene Creed and the Nicene Council on the nature of Jesus. Were he a prophet? Arius and his followers used to believe that he was actually a prophet, and even though they weren't as sizable as the other side, but the other side was basically put forward, I mean, the other side being that he was Son of God and so on, basically because of the emperor at that time, if I understand correctly. So can you comment on that?
Sure. In terms of the Council of Nicaea in 325, right, they did debate on the nature of Jesus. The big question is he God? And yes, Constantine was presiding over that. Yes, he did present some pressure, and he held to the deity of Jesus. You could put forth a case, I agree, and say that just because that council decided that doesn't mean anything. However, later on, with Constantine's successor, and the next, there were two more councils within the same century, 357 and 378, I believe. And those two councils upheld the decision at the Council of Nicaea, even when the next emperor was against it and was threatening them with their lives to deny the deity of Christ. They still upheld it. But I think when it comes down to who is Jesus, is he God? Even though I may respect what some of the council said, I'm going to look at the scriptures myself, and I think that there's some really clear scriptures like John 1:1, Colossians 2:9, and some others which certainly paint the deity of Jesus, and that it's found in the New Testament and the Apostolic Fathers.
I need to respond to his question about the Quran. The scriptures that you look to were written by people. The Quran was written by people. There are contradictions within the Quran. We don't have an original version. There's a lot of Islamist scholarship that shows that the formation of the Quran is under a lot of doubt. They don't know what the original one is. The surahs are some are authentic and some aren't. I've just been reading a book by Ibn Warraq on the formation of the Quran, and it is not as solid and not as clear as you make it seem to be. I debated an Islamic scholar last January in Queens, New York, and discovered that the Quran has just as many problems as the Bible does when it comes to knowing the authenticity and the reliability of it. So I disagree with your claim that the Quran is that. It has a couple of nice poetic passages, but it's not a very inspiring book to me, and neither is the Bible, actually. So
I have to disagree with that. It is very inspiring, and I know of little scholars that say the things that you say. And indeed, the Bible in itself has some inspiring passages even for everyone. Thanks.
Okay, I've got a very quick question for Dan. Dan,
yeah.
Are you happier since you gave up God?
Yes, I'm much happier since I gave up God, yes.
Okay, me too. Thanks for coming out tonight.
All right. Closing? Yeah. Well, thanks for staying through all this. This was an ordeal. It's more fun for us, I think, being up here. And thank you, Mike. I really respect your openness and your willingness to debate. A lot of Christians are not willing to do that. They just want to believe by faith and not dig in deep. And I admire that in a person like you. You're a good man. The idea that I presented tonight is that the story of the resurrection of Jesus is a legend, which means that it started as a simple idea that Jesus spiritually rose, and later, through the decades, grew into a more exaggerated, more extraordinary, more outrageous idea in Luke and John, and later in the Gospel of Peter and that. The facts that I gave tonight support that, and Mike agreed that at least in the telling there's an increase in the number of extraordinary events as time passes. We disagree on many of the other facts. But let me talk about this. The idea that the story of the resurrection is a legend, it's not such a bad idea. It's a very respectful idea. It's respectful of the humanity of the early Christians. We do know that the human race possesses an immense propensity to create and believe and propagate falsehood. We all agree with that. So what makes the early Christians exempt? Weren't they just people? Did they never make mistakes? Were they so superhuman that they always resisted the temptations of exaggeration and rhetoric? Did they have perfect memories? Do you have a perfect memory? Given the discrepancies in their accounts, why not treat those early believers like ourselves? Not like cartoon characters, but as real human beings with normal human fears, desires, and limitations. The fact that my grandmother was hallucinating did not make me respect or love her any less. I loved my grandma, even when she was hallucinating something that I knew was false. The legend idea is also respectful of the historical method. We are not required to jettison natural regularity that makes history work. We can take the New Testament accounts as reports of what people sincerely believed to be true, not what is necessarily true. We can honor the question, do you believe everything you read? Of course you don't. The legend idea is also respectful of theology. Think about it. If Jesus bodily ascended into physical clouds, then we are presented with a spatially limited, flat earth God sitting on a material throne of human size with a right and a left hand. If Jesus physically levitated into the sky, where is his body now? If the bodily resurrection is viewed as a legendary embellishment, then believers are free to view their God as a boundless spiritual being, not defined in human dimensions like the pagan gods were defined. Bible scholars conclude, on the basis of a close analysis of all the resurrection reports, we decided, and this is the Westar Institute, good scholars, critical scholars, the resurrection of Jesus was not perceived initially to depend on what happened to his body. It probably decayed, as do all corpses. The resurrection of Jesus was not an event that happened on the first Easter Sunday. It could not have been captured by a video camera. We conclude that it does not seem necessary for Christians to believe the literal veracity of any of the later appearance narratives. Finally, the legend idea that I presented tonight is respectful of the freedom to believe. If the resurrection of Jesus were proved to be a blunt fact of history, then we would have no choice. There would be no faith. You can't have the freedom to believe if you don't also have the freedom not to believe.
I too would like to thank Dan for the gracious manner that he has displayed tonight, and I just want to let him know that I've appreciated this debate. This has been fun. Tonight, I'd like to kind of close by sharing a story with you put forth by comedian Emo Phillips. He talks about a guy up on a bridge, and he's getting ready to jump off and kill himself, and another guy comes up on the bridge, and he says, he wants to talk him down from it, and so he tries to get the guy in a conversation, and he says, so before you jump, have you got your relationship with God right? And he says, well, I'm working on that right now. And he says, well, are you Muslim? Are you Hindu, Jewish, Christian? What are you? He says, well, I'm a Christian. He says, well, small world, me too, trying to develop a little rapport. And he says, well, are you Catholic, Protestant, or Greek Orthodox? He says, well, I'm Protestant. Me too. What denomination? Baptist. Me too. Northern Baptist or Southern Baptist? Northern Baptist. Me too. Northern Conservative Baptist or Northern Liberal Baptist? Northern Conservative Baptist. Me too. Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist Great Lakes region or Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist Eastern region? Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist Great Lakes region. Me too. Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1879 or Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1912. He said Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1912. And I screamed, die heretic, and I pushed him over. I think what Philip's story does there is to kind of remind us that we need to stick to the things that really matter. And see, the things even about the bodily resurrection and the inerrancy of Scripture are things even upon which some Christians disagree on. But that's not the topics for discussion this evening. Those are different debates. Our topic discussion is, did Jesus rise from the dead? Not what was the nature of his resurrection body, or is the Bible inerrant or inspired? Tonight I presented 5 facts which are well attested. 4 of them are granted by nearly every scholar out there, and 5 by around 75% of all scholars. And based on that, I said, in the absence of any plausible naturalistic explanations, Jesus' resurrection is the best explanation for the data. Well, Dan responded by saying, well, it's a legend. It evolved from belief in a spiritual resurrection to bodily resurrection. But I pointed out that, no, Paul did believe in a bodily resurrection. We can see it in the Creed in 1 Corinthians 15. What goes down in burial comes up in resurrection. We can see it in Romans 8:11, where he says, just as God raised Jesus' mortal body, he'll raise yours too. In Philippians 3:21, where our bodies are going to be transformed to be like Christ. Transformed, not eliminated. And even most critics admit, who believe that Paul saw a vision, they'll still say that Paul believed in a bodily resurrection of Jesus. Remember the quote I gave you from Gerd Ludemann. And then remember, it's not this thing that they're just working toward and hoping to spread this myth. Remember, John Donovan Cross, in his own guide that he quoted, said that these experiences Paul meant for us to understand that his experience and the disciples' experience, they were legitimate experiences where they saw the risen Jesus. We have to be able to account for those. And evolving legend doesn't do that. Besides, even if what Dan said was correct and these disciples were wanting to carry it on because they believed in the Jesus that they had known, Paul wasn't of that frame of mind. He was trying to get rid of Christians, and it doesn't explain how he came to believe that Jesus rose and had appeared to him. Neither does it explain the appearance to James. So you have those problems as well. I would just kind of close by saying this. I hope it's become clear tonight that there is good evidence for Jesus' resurrection. And even if you remain skeptical tonight, I hope that you'll at least agree with the prominent atheist philosopher Antony Flew, who said that even though he doesn't believe in the resurrection, the evidence merits belief in it to the point where Christians are rational in believing that Jesus rose from the dead. It's not an irrational belief. I would like to thank you all for attending this evening. And if you're here tonight seeking the truth, I would like to encourage you to continue on that road. And I would like to assure you that the risen Jesus does live. And we haven't mentioned personal experience at all, but I've walked with the Lord now for over 30 years, and I just experience the living reality of Jesus in my life every day as I grow closer to him. And I have just a love for him, and I'm really looking forward to meeting him someday. And I want to assure you that the same Jesus that rose from the dead loves you, and he loves Dan. And in fact, with Dan, he stands there like the father of the prodigal son saying, please come back. I love you, and I want you to come back. And he would like everyone in here to know him personally and spend an eternity with him. And I want to thank you all for your